Chad Haag, reporting from Southern India. So glad to be joined today once again by Flowers or Love Flowers. Thank you so much for joining me again today.
Thanks for having me on, Chad. It's great to be back, and it's been a while. But yeah, we've finally been able to coordinate our schedules, so it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like we're doing this once, I don't know, every couple months, but it's always really interesting when we get to. So yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time once again.
No, thank you. We've got a lot of interesting things, and after these dialogues, I'm just my head is full of ideas, and yeah, it'd be nice to do this maybe a little bit more regularly, but you kind of get to mull over things a little bit and then come back to it. So yeah, it works out.
Yeah, we've been planning this one for a while now to get back to some of the stuff we were talking about at the end of last stream, which I think we finished talking about deep memes and religion. And,
Yeah.
we'll see if we can, relate that somehow to Aristotle. I think there is a lot of potential there. But as far as Aristotle goes, I'll just go ahead and maybe have you lead the discussion with some of the things that you had planned. I understand that you've been reading, at the very least, the De Anima on the Soul, and maybe a few other texts by Aristotle. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so I read your book, a critique of transcendental memeology, and it was really fascinating. And it was fascinating in part because there were just so many intriguing concepts that were foreign to me. The peak oil critique, the deep memes, and then the things that kind of interested me the most were, thinking about forms and language being secondary to form. And by the end, I was kind of left wanting to understand exactly where you were coming from, in the same way that after listening to like an interesting album by a new band, you kind of wonder what the band's main influences are, and you go hunting after that source material. Except that in your book, the influences are made pretty clear, and it seemed to me that Aristotle was the thinker that was most central to your work. So, but I still wasn't sure where to begin, and so you suggested his treatise on the soul, De Anima, and so yeah, I just wanted to begin with my. That's the text that I kind of spent a lot of time reading. It was difficult. He's an ancient thinker, and all these concepts were new to me. So, yeah, I just wanted to begin with my general impression of Aristotle as a thinker. I was actually trying to come up with one word to characterize his approach to the world, and I've settled on taxonomic, because he seems to be a very systematic thinker, and he wants to organize everything into like an ordered list of hierarchies. He's always distinguishing between what's primary and what's secondary, and he begins the treatise by saying that even certain questions have priority. Questions regarding knowledge are higher than others, and understanding the soul is one of the highest because it leads to an understanding of nature itself. And then, and he wants to insist that we not only ask the right questions, but we also ask them in the right order. And then he says, like, the definitions that we give commonly are like the conclusions of a syllogism, whereas he wants to actually go through the process of getting to that conclusion, and he says he wants to reveal the ground of definitions by going through the premises. So yeah, it was just interesting kind of letting this kind of thinker colonize my mind for a couple of weeks. I think it's pretty remarkable that someone thousands of years ago was trying to approach knowledge so methodically and systematically. I don't know. Would you agree with that characterization?
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree with it. And I mean, that is a way that even people with scientific backgrounds still maybe use him as a standard for how maybe taxonomic their approaches. So, one philosophy major when I was an undergrad who had a much, more formal scientific background, you people who double major in physics and philosophy, and many will say things like, some sciences are still very Aristotelian, like biology is still pretty Aristotelian compared to some sciences which have had to depart from his approach. So in biology, you still have these, these taxonomies quite literally of like, you have kingdoms and you have
genus, yeah.
That's right. It's been a long time since I took biology, but everybody knows how this ordering goes. And there's also teleology and biology, which is hard to find in other sciences. So you have, as Yuri Levin says in one of his videos, you have like, your organ, your pancreas is for this, your heart is for this. It has a purpose, etc. And a lot of like quantum physics from people more knowledgeable than I about that will say you can't import that kind of bias necessarily into every science anymore. But be that as it may, I think that Aristotle is not necessarily to be evaluated on the standard of natural science as these people would tend to do, because if you look closely at the metaphysics, the confusion in the Middle Ages, for example, with Thomas Aquinas, his commentary on the metaphysics, is that it's really a book about three things. And many times people forget, some of the concerns of metaphysics in favor. So we usually think that it's a book about being, and obviously it is. Or we might think that it's a book about, the highest beings. In the Middle Ages, that becomes God, etc., which it is. But it's also a book about first principles. And the kind of work that you were mentioning, which Aristotle's interested in, is something that we risk forgetting if we think of him as just doing natural science at an empiricist level. In which case, of course, he obviously got a lot of things wrong empirically. That's not disputed. But that's only if you're forgetting that the biggest concern for him, I think, was finding these principles that you talk about. And I would venture to argue that maybe those are more like transcendental, limits, or they're transcendentally irreducible parts of investigating the thing you are, rather than these sort of empirical data which you just discovered. And that's why I think he's still relevant today. He got a lot of things empirically wrong, like number one, the Earth being center of the universe, obviously. But I don't think that the methodology is going to be as easy to refute, because if you really look at the structure of consciousness and at many ways of approaching the structure of things, I still think a lot of those principles which he found are still relevant today. I mean, would you maybe agree with that based on your reading of this, the past couple of months?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even, yeah, I agree. I mean, even if you acknowledge that he got a lot of things empirically wrong, yeah, the thinking about forms, I mean, how the senses work, the kind of the general lines of his thought are seem to be, very on point. And but I guess even I wanted to make a point even about like like let's just to give you an example of what I'm trying to get at, like the first book where like I think modern readers reading the first book of De Anima, which is Aristotle giving these the accounts of his predecessors on the theories, the previous theories on the soul. I think the modern reader is going to approach that text and quickly dismiss it as these pseudoscientific or naive pre-modern attempts to explain the world. But the second time that I read this treatise, I realized that I think these are serious attempts to account for the world using only the sources that were available, which is some combination of logic, observation, and and really creative imagination and speculation. Basically nothing but one's own intellectual faculties. And it just makes you think about how far we've come, because we're kind of just content to merely defer to scientific authority for answers to these kinds of questions. And I think the phrase that kind of embodies the modern disposition towards understanding is something like, we used to think such and such then, but now we know better. But I think the value of reading ancient philosophy is that it allows you to think with very foreign concepts, that come from a very distant time. And you get to go through the thought process of people trying to account for the world with nothing but their own intellectual faculties. So I just think it brings you to a different place. And then if you read it with a certain openness, then you can arrive at those kinds of transcendental truths that I think would be missed if you just approached it as the way that a modern scientific mindset might approach it. Is that kind of what you were saying?
I definitely agree with that. And I mean, as far as like book one of De Anima goes, and so many of the first books of Aristotelian treatises might be a little bit frustrating to a modern reader, as giving the views of his predecessors. But I think the easiest thing to miss about that is that they're all pretty much making the same mistake. And Aristotle's predecessors all assumed pretty much that the soul had to be a certain material. And right. The question for them was which one. So you have some people say, well, obviously it's fire. Some people say, well, it's air. Obviously, the ancient Greek word for soul is kind of etymologically from the word for air, wind, basically, in the sense that if you're no longer alive, which means that your soul has departed the body, you're no longer breathing. So there is this very intuitive sense that the soul must have something to do with that. Now the question becomes, which element is it? And Aristotle's main contribution was to show that even asking the question is missing the fact that you're assuming that the fundamental construct, which has to be paired with that, is material. And he shows that it's actually not. And I think we're making the same mistake again today, because we've once again become used to thinking that the answer is something material, that even Zizek, for example, has basically fallen into the neuroplasticity fad, which is that, it doesn't make sense to talk about scientific essences of the kind that like Jordan Peterson is interested in, to get back to that debate. Because, if you really go all the way down to something like the essence of the brain, you'll find that it doesn't exist, because there's a type of plasticity to the brain which is more in line with the dialectical materialism, which might be smuggled in from Marx. This is the argument of Zizek and Adrian Johnston and Catherine Malibu and all of the other people who tagged onto that. But I think that they're just repeating the same mistake as someone like, I don't know, Heraclitus, and asking, well, what's the material cause? Whereas I think that Aristotle broke apart from that and said that you're misunderstanding that the fundamental construct of a material cause cannot be applied to the fundamental maybe construct of form or to teleology, etc. And I think that that's what we could still gain from this, is realize that even the whole neuroplasticity fad is basically taking us all the way back to Aristotle's predecessors. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way to look at it. Material, being acquainted with only the material aspects of things will give us only a partial understanding of what that thing is. So for Aristotle, understanding means really being acquainted with all four types of explanations. So whereas I guess these modern theorists are just focusing, going back to, I guess, Empedocles and all of these people who thought that, we're just talking about, they were also talking about elements, right? So they thought that if you understood the nature of the elements, and then you could arrive at how understanding works, because the soul is just made up of all the elements, and that's what allows it to understand the world. I mean, that's kind of what science is in the business of, right? Breaking everything down to its constituent elements, and then seeing how the body interfaces with all this matter. But yeah, for Aristotle, there's four ways of understanding something. There, and then so he begins with a discussion of substance, right? And you've pointed this out in your lecture as well. Substance for Aristotle is basically two things, and it's a unity of two things. It's matter, which he, the phrase that he uses is that which is not a this, because matter is just what can potentially become a definite form. And when we're talking about form, a form is basically what we identify when we identify something as a this. So it's really, that's what's getting at the essence of something, not the matter. And then there's also the agent that initiates action or actuates movement, and then there's the telos, as you mentioned, the end for which something is done, or the being in whose interest something is done. So you have the material, the formal, the efficient, and the teleological. And I guess the most important concept in Aristotle in relation to your own philosophy of memes is his theory of forms, and specifically the way that the mind functions through the grasping of forms, right? So would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I think that an example from the body of peak oil literature, as you just mentioned, might be useful for that distinction, particularly related to, say, peak oil. And I mentioned in the book that I'm writing now that of the four great early peak oil writers, they each kind of focused on a different one of the four causes. So Michael Rupert, who was one of the earliest people to talk about peak oil before he mysteriously died in 2014, supposedly by suicide. I don't know if that's the case, because he mentions in his book that he had been shot at multiple times by, presumably some people who didn't like what he was exposing to the public. But I'll leave that to another video. But anyway, in his early work, Crossing the Rubicon, he gives a list of all the things in your house that are made out of oil in one form or another. He said, so, your remote control is made of it. Your shampoo bottle is made of it. Your toothbrush is made of it. Your bottled water that you drink to try to stay healthy is made from it. And if you get frustrated and throw this book in the trash can, you'll just be confirming the irony of the situation, because that's made of it too. And that's absolutely right. I'm not disputing it. It is literally the case now that almost everything in your life world is made of oil. That's the material cause of it. Okay. And that's a huge problem, because we cannot rely on that going on forever. But I think that with someone like Greer, you have a different approach. It's not contradictory. It's just different in the sense that although Greer obviously also would acknowledge the material cause part, he's also interested in the formal cause part. And that's how you have an analysis that goes beyond the sort of engineering problem of, well, how can we just make stuff with an alternate material, or how can we keep making stuff with this, whatever. Whereas he gets the spiritual problem, or the epistemological problem of, how can we even begin to think about it if the form of our thinking is already basically that? So I think that one thing which anybody watching this video who might be skeptical of bringing back Aristotle from the ancient era to the modern world, especially for something as serious as peak oil, would be this. It's, how can we even begin to tackle the problem if we remain stuck within a way of thinking, which really is just the form of oil mapped into the abstract territory of human thought? And for Greer, what that means is you can't even really think without using the myth of progress, unless you've explicitly tried not to. Which, you and I talk about all the time about, we explicitly try to maybe move beyond that. We recognize when other people are doing, but most people it's just blinded them. They don't realize that they're thinking with the form of progress, which is just the form of oil abstracted from oil. So your thought isn't materially made out of petroleum at the chemical level, but it still has the form. And that's not controversial from an Aristotelian standpoint, because in De Anima, he mentions that that's what understanding is you abstract the form and you subtract the material cause and you get the form. That's like with the a ring and a piece of wax metaphor. And that's what we do all the time. We're thinking oil without knowing that we're thinking oil. And that's why focusing on form is important. And that's why Aristotle, I think, is important to peak oil, although I don't know that anybody has realized that before.
No, yeah. No, yeah. I mean, and that's why Aristotle's understanding of the soul is not as something ethereal or mystical entity, because he's thinking, he's thinking in terms of the four causes, but really the soul is kind of the organizing principle, right? And it's the essence which organizes life in that recipient matter, in the material cause. So, yeah, it's interesting because he moves through this line of thinking, and then we get to the types of soul, right? Because there are different principles that occur in the various kinds of life on the planet. And so some creatures are capable of nutrition, growth, and reproduction. All creatures are capable of those things. So, including plants. And so so for him, this is the nutritive or reproductive soul. And then he says that animals are at least capable of sensory perception. And the interesting thing for me is when he describes the senses, he says that, smell, sight, hearing, all involve mediums which allow for the transmission of forms, of whatever objects, their respective objects of perception, but without the matter. So it's not just that this is a theoretical tool that's important for understanding the world. Aristotle is saying this is inherently, as you said, this is how the mind is inherently grasping its environment, and that's the interesting insight that he reaches at the end of book 2. And then he continues in book 3 by saying that the mind is also, by its very nature, like the senses, also in the business of abstracting forms. So, yeah, I mean, I know you don't have the book on hand. If I could just run through like one or two quotes, just to illustrate what exactly we're trying to take from Aristotle. So in book 2, he says, by a sense is meant what has the power of receiving onto itself the sensible form of things without the matter, right? When you smell something, you're not coming directly into contact with whatever's producing that odor, but the form of it is kind of being transmitted through the medium of air, and then your nose is kind of receiving that form. And for the mind, the way that he puts it is, so in I think paragraph 30 of 591, he says, mind is in a sense potentially whatever is thinkable, though actually it is nothing until it has thought. And then this is what I wanted to focus on in relation to your own work. He says, what the mind thinks must be in it just as characters may be said to be on a writing tablet on which as yet nothing actually stands written. This is exactly what happens with the mind. Um, so, yeah, again, images aren't merely what happens when we consciously abstract forms from a material substance. It's the way that the mind is inherently structured, and even the senses, as he points out, function in this way. So, yeah, what I wanted to draw attention to is really the second quote, the passage in book 3 where he says that the mind is potentially everything because it's potentially all forms. And this, and in that way, it's like the characters on a clay tablet, from which you can form that any sentence or phrase that you could utter. But so, and your book is again also about the way that forms structure thought. As you say, the work is basically addressing the deeper question of what the conditions for human subjectivity are that allow for the generation and spread of memes. And memes are just defined as general shapes that structure human thought. And you distinguish between so these two kinds of shapes, right? So deep memes are like underlying structures, and then the shallow memes that we're familiar with, which are like all the viral images on social media, with a subtitle, but also machines and also language. All of these shallower pieces of information are basically structured by this deeper underlying shape, to which the shallower memes, as you say, must have a minimal correspondence. So I think I was trying to kind of parse the difference between your approach and Aristotle's, although I mean, I see the importance of forms to your thinking, but I feel it seems like you're going much further than Aristotle to say that the subject's frame of consciousness is already in a particular form, already in the form of the deep meme, and it's already operating with a certain shape or a geometrical bias, as you put it, even before it encounters any external forms out there, including language, which you say memes presuppose. Memes are a presupposition of language. So it seems like what you're saying is that it's more like a mold, which already has a definite shape than Aristotle's clay tablet, which allow for the mind to take on any form. It's more like a mold that things have to be fit into, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and thank you for also mentioning some really great quotes from that text. It's a lot to talk about there. I think that one place to begin is that I don't mean to imply in the text that the meme it's not like the innate ideas by Descartes. So for Descartes, you have ideas as for him basically pictures that the mind is occupied with. So right at the moment we're kind of occupied with the idea of this discussion, right? But not all ideas are maybe empirical. There's also for Descartes the innate ideas, and those are ideas you get basically for free, like 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, that would later be called like a priori, but for Descartes, since it's a little simpler, we'll just use him. Those are innate ideas, so you don't have to go out and get them; they're already in your mind. Okay, and that's not what I imply about the deep memes. It's not that it's already innate, and you can't maybe begin to overcome it empirically because it's already there. But I think that it will seem that way to somebody who is so stuck within a particular way of viewing the world that they'll never feel that there was a moment where they obtained it. So I don't think anybody in fossil fuel modernity is going to look back on their life and say, oh yes, it was at that age that I started thinking this way. But that doesn't mean that it was innate. I think that what you find with fossil fuel modernity is that you still have to get the meme from outside. Okay, so the shapes are not really these sort of eternally valid, forms, which could not be different than they are, because of some sort of rationalistic fixedness, like 2 + 2 = 4. Rather, they are obtained from outside, and the contingency of the thing that they're gained from has to be emphasized. So fossil fuels are a really weird substance that could have just as easily, I guess, not been discovered at this point in history. And if that was the case, you wouldn't have this sort of deep meaning, because it had to sort of be, I guess, deduced from the empirical presence of this thing. And, the book I'm writing right now, it's more specifically talked about as you have this type of presence, as we were discussing, just a few weeks ago when I was in the hospital in India for about a week. Just that, we usually think of presence as something like literally seeing something right in front of your eyes, right? And that's a type of presence, but it'd be wrong to say that presence is simply that, because if you look at the New Testament, the word for presence, which is coincidentally parousia, which of course contains the word substance in it, mentioned. Parousia, which means emerging from substance, or if you take it even more literally than that, ousia is like a piece of land. I guess that land is present if you have this emergence from it as something really there. And that's what presence, that's what parousia is. And most of the occurrences of parousia in the New Testament refer to a very specific kind of presence, which is Jesus' second coming. And, you might see in an English translation of the New Testament just the coming of Jesus, but in Greek, it actually is the presence. We're waiting until the presence of Jesus. So it would be more proper, I think, to translate the second coming as the second presence. But the interesting thing, if you read Galatians, for example, Paul talks about the world we're in right now is evil. He uses like the word the eon, whatever. Like we're living in an evil era, eon. We're living in an evil age, but he means that at this point, before the second presence of Jesus, the world is in an evil era, an evil state, assuming that when he comes, that will change. So the second coming isn't just going to be experienced by one person at a time who can physically see Jesus one at a time. I'm saying Paul's understanding of it. Okay. Paul's understanding rather is when Jesus' presence is within the world again, it's going to be an instantaneous change of the world. And it's going to be an instantaneous change of everybody on the world who will either be, liberated by it, or they'll be damned by it, or whatever, however you want to get into that sort of interpretation.
Radical restructuring, maybe.
Well, it's restructuring. That's true. And it's also just going to directly affect them, because you can't just be somewhere in the world when the second coming happens and not know about it. You know what I mean? Like it's that's not even an option. So let's just say Jesus comes back. I'm talking in Paul's understanding in Jerusalem. Okay. It's not that you have to wait till he moves from Jerusalem to Rome to be affected by it. And I think something a little bit like that goes on with the parousia of fossil fuels. It's like you don't just see it in front of your eyes. In fact, you could pass your entire life without ever seeing a physical barrel of petroleum. Most people don't deal with it. But that does not mean that you're living outside the presencing of it. And the deep meme in many ways is just the presencing of fossil fuels, kind of like, I don't know, the presencing of Jesus, although, please don't be offended, anyone who, might find that blasphemous. It's not meaning to be. But, it's a little bit, it's like that, you know what I mean? Like, I'll argue in the book that, the memeing is just a different sort of transcendental register of the same thing. And that's why memes are not the deepest. I talk about deep memes, but deeper than that is just the parousia. Okay. And
hard limits, right?
Yeah. It is experienced as a limit, but it's also something which can paradoxically only be limiting if it's already present. Okay, and when you lose the presencing of it, paradoxically, you don't the limit, you lose it altogether. But that's a whole nother discussion. But I mean, regarding the relation between parousia rather than like literally seeing something and the meme, I think that it actually does kind of play into Aristotle's view that you don't have anything occur within the void, because in the physics, for example, he says that there can't be space is this empty void in which you put stuff. If you're talking about space, you're already talking about a type of directionality which it will have if it's already spaced by something material. That space is already going to have a non-neutral directionality, in the sense that flame is going to go up, air is going to go up, earth is going to drop to the ground. And that's why you don't really have this void. And I think that, to finish this up real quick, for me, you also have with something like fossil fuels, something other than an empty space that just gets filled in. It's rather, if you're dwelling on the earth, you already have a certain characterization of that element which is presencing itself to you. So the reason I say you can't think outside memes is because there really is no empty void which has no, nothing presencing that would translate to you as there's no meme there. If you're dwelling, the void is really impossible. So I don't know if how much all that kind of got placed together, if it made much sense. But I don't know. What are your general ideas about that?
No, that made a lot of sense to me. I mean, there was a lot to take in, but no, I see what you're saying. It's not that the mind emerges with, as I put it, in a particular, as a mold. It's that, well, in the book, you say it this way. You say that there are these structuring hard limits, and the deep meme is kind of these shapes pass on the meaning, the horizon of meaning that these limits embody. So yeah, they themselves kind of represent these hard limits, and they change from era to era, right? So in the past, it was big game. In agrarian times, it was grain, and then now it's these kinds of explosive energy sources. So no, I that was clear in the book that you weren't saying. Yeah, no, I think you addressed my question there. So, but this idea of clay tablets and whether the mind is, kind of a blank form that can take on any other form, or whether it's kind of it kind of takes on the shape of the deep memes, which are just relaying a hard limit in the world out there. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not making much.
Well,
much
I think
sense
one
here.
thing, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the blank tablet, and here's what Aristotle certainly would agree with, is that even if the mind could be compared to that, the world never is. Okay, so the emphasis in the physics about how, one of the debates in ancient Greece, I guess, was whether there's a void somewhere in space, and
Right.
he says, well, there can't be a void, because if you have space, that space is already characterized by a type of directionality. So if you have an element, it's going to have a natural tendency to move towards movement. So depending on the element, it's going to be different. So if you have an element of earth, which, like a stone would be that. It's going to have a natural movement down, okay? And you can artificially, counteract that, but it's still, he gave the example of if you dig a pit, it's going to fall even further. It's not just that the floor is the limit of how far it'll move. If you dig a pit, it'll drop even further and further until it reaches the center. And with air and fire, they rise. So if we can accept that some space has that directionality, the question would be, is there any space that doesn't? And his answer to that would be no. And I think that if you counteract with, well, what about the spaces between? Well, no, that's just air. Air also has it. So I think that the principle of there being no void in space is more primordial than the notion of there being whether there's void in the mind. And I think that if the mind is occupied with the world, it might, the way I would interpret this is it might have a fluidity with regard to what shape it could take. In fact, there's not a limit on those. I don't mean to imply in the book that there's only 4. You could imagine a world where there's a 5th, a 6th, a 7th, who knows, maybe sometime in history. But I am saying that because the world is never a non-memeological void, okay, because what the void for our purposes would mean is something free of memeological shape, okay, and the world wouldn't have that, okay, and because of that, your subjective frame is never also going to be a mere void that stuff gets put into. Now that's, once again, that's a kind of fine distinction. To say that it could be any shape is not the same as saying that it has no shape.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe I had another way that I think we can approach this. So, the whole clay tablet analogy kind of got me thinking about language. And now you draw a distinction between linguistic creativity and memeological creativity that I thought was really fascinating. I used to actually read popular books on linguistics, while I was in college, and I remember reading about the concept of linguistic relativity. And I guess I wanted to compare the deep meme structuring of subjectivity. I mean, with the understanding that you make, that creativity in language and creativity in memes are not the same thing, but I still thought there was some kind of parallel that maybe we could draw between the deep meme structuring of subjectivity and the idea of language as with the concept of linguistic relativity, the concept of the idea of language as the primary thing that orients a subject into a worldview. So like the concept comes in 2 varieties, right? There's a strong one and a weak one. Or maybe you could say a simplistic, deterministic version and a more nuanced one. And the first would be to say that a specific language locks you into a specific cultural perspective or worldview. And then the more nuanced version would be that language, it embodies certain cultural values and cultural limits. And there's a subtle feedback loop between cognition, culture, and language, and the non-linguistic aspects of culture. So would it be fair to say that the main idea behind the structuring effect of the deep meme is closer to the second understanding of linguistic relativity as this kind of subtle feedback loop between cognition, culture, and language, which also, I guess, kind of agrees with that idea that there's no neutral space that can. Yeah, does that make sense?
Well, I'll admit not being as knowledgeable about this particular subject as I should be, and I don't feel confident that I understand fully what the theory is. Could you maybe just provide one example?
Okay, so one example is that uh, for instance, there's a tribe in the Amazon that speaks a language whose grammar has explicit limits on the type of information that you're able to provide. So basically, anytime you introduce a piece of information, you have to indicate where you got that information, and it has to be more or less empirical. So it really reduces the possibilities for speculation and like, yeah, wild, imaginings. You have to basically say, if you like, to say that Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, you have to say where you're getting that information from, and that's a part of the grammar itself. And if you fail to provide an adequate account of where you got that from, then that phrase just loses intelligibility, because so you didn't get it from firsthand experience, so you didn't get it from an elder who experienced it firsthand. Then what exactly is it? So it kind of loses that. It loses its meaning if you fail to provide that piece of information, which is kind of encoded in the grammar. So,
Yeah,
um,
go ahead.
yeah. So it's. I mean, I guess the specifics aren't. I mean, my point is that you seem to be making a more subtle point. It's not that we're locked into a worldview. It's that there's a more subtle feedback loop between how we think, the language we use, and these underlying shapes, which are themselves informed by different limits, civilizational limits, which change from era to era. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've heard examples of things like that before. I think it was the language of the Roma people in Europe. Somebody mentioned that not much is known about that language relative to others. I think that there's actually a prohibition that if an anthropologist comes, you're not supposed to language with them or something. But one thing I heard about their language, if I recall this correctly, is there's a prohibition in the language against talking about abstractions. So you and I in modern American English might, use a linguistic construct to turn an adjective into a noun. Excuse me. So, you might have a hot piece of fish cooking on the stove, and that's acceptable to call that piece of fish, hot. But then we might, move on to talking about what is hotness in general, and that's prohibited in this language, because the idea is if you turn abstractions into the subject of discussion, you are liable to get into bullshitting other people, and to prevent that from happening, they have this prohibition. Okay, so whether that's actually true of that group or not, for the moment, we'll suspect. Let's just say that there are certain grammatical restrictions on what kinds of things you're able to talk about. Okay, which in these cases seems like they're doing that to prevent people from bullshitting other people, right? Which is a very worthy thing to try to do. We could use a lot more of that in our culture.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is one of my ideas too, right? I mean, I talk about how linguistification opens up the pathways for bullshitting far more than other registers. So I've mentioned with regard to economics that if you don't have a monetary economy, it's a lot harder to get away with economic bullshit. Because in a barter economy where, let's just say you're a blacksmith, okay, who's trying to barter with a carpenter or a pig farmer, it's very hard to bullshit your way to stuff you don't deserve, because if you're a blacksmith who does not have the form, right, okay, or you don't have the consistency, right, you have tools that snap or whatever because they haven't been properly conditioned. Um, you're not going to be able to. You could get away with it for a little bit. Eventually, you won't be able to anymore. But with a financialized economy, where everything is symbolic, you can get away with remarkable levels of unearned wealth. I mean, somebody explained to me, for example, what college tuition is worth $50,000 a year, where most of what you're going to be doing is sitting in a circle and looking at your watch and passing the time. And
Watching movies. Yeah.
Yeah, or I mean, yeah, you mentioned this. Like, you wanted to read Foucault's Discipline and Punishment class, and they showed you a documentary about prison, right?
Yeah, we read 2 excerpts, and then it was just utter bullshit. It was like, we read these excerpts, we pretended to understand things that were probably taken out of context, and then we kind of just fancifully, interpreted and applied it to a movie that was set in prison. So yeah, no, go ahead, continue.
Well, no, I mean, that's exactly right. And, that's the kind of abuse which, these languages we've been mentioning had formal prohibitions against letting stuff like that get away. Because, I mean, the question of whether it's worth $50,000, I know that maybe at your particular school that might have not been, but you could imagine NYU, someplace where the tuition actually is that high, and all of the expenses at NYU together, even like 5 years ago, $70,000 a year. There was a news story about a girl who went to NYU, and she did not have a way to come up with $70,000 for the school year, and she was like booted out of school. And obviously, what they wanted her to do was just borrow the entire sum. So she was like a middle class or a lower class girl. She didn't have that much money in her pocket at the moment, and I think she didn't want to borrow it, so she was out. Okay, but I knew several people who went to NYU, and the level of Foucault at that school is a joke too. I mean, I'll just come right out and say it on YouTube. It was a total joke. Like, I remember somebody was reading Foucault in grad school, and they couldn't even explain the difference between power as merely prohibitive and not, which is a very basic part of Foucault, is that power does not just prohibit or repress. It's more, it's a different understanding of the power than that. And you could imagine at a school where the tuition's $50,000 a year, you can't even get that, right? So, I mean, at what point do we say that we've just completely given ourselves over to linguistification and bullshit, and we've just completely departed from any concern whatsoever for the form or the quality of the product we're getting? And that is the type of perversion which I think language opens up with, which other registers of meaning do not. And I mean, I think that that's something which the prohibitions follow from that, is my honest opinion. Bring this back to the tribes. I think that people who realize that language can be abused, and I consider, like, in this context, numbers on a screen telling you how much you owe to go to NYU, that's language too. Okay. In this context, it's linguistic because it's a message telling you how much you have to pay. Okay. I'm not saying that every number is inherently linguistic. I'm saying that the bill is an example of using language to take advantage of people. And it's an abuse, which I think the tribal cultures who have formal prohibitions against it are like the ancient and medieval cultures who had formal prohibitions against usury. It's not because they're primitive. It's because they understand a lot better than we do that you have to have prohibitions against that.
No, yeah, and that kind of understanding, I think, you mentioned in you had a video titled Aristotle on language and the telos of college, which I thought was a great way of applying this kind of formal understanding to college. And to kind of give a one sentence summary, you just said, college is the form of college is debt. And I'll tell you, you know, it's funny. Like when I watched that video, I thought about it. I kind of related it to my own experience. As you said, I went to college that didn't have the kind of exorbitant tuition rates as a place like NYU. But the funny thing is, when I became frustrated, and I tried to, to the best of my ability, read things on my own. My professor at the time kind of saw that I was making this effort, and she was actually kind of annoyed. And instead of saying, I can engage you in a better way, and then let me try to accommodate your intellectual interests. As a teacher, right? That's what I would expect from a teacher. But instead, she said, maybe you should go to the new school. And for those who don't know, the new school, their yearly tuition is 40 plus 40, 40, it's like 43,000. I think it's like up to 46,000. So like that, if a form of college had, if we were thinking about college in those terms, then that might have kind of registered in her mind, but it was just completely lost. She just completely took it for granted that that I should, leave my studies in her department and go to this other school that costs like quadruple the amount, more than quadruple. So yeah, it's a lack of thinking along those lines. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what would be the real difference at that school anyway, to be perfectly honest?
Right. No, I didn't at all buy this idea that I was going to get more engagement at a school just for shelling out, a vastly larger sum of money. So,
well, I mean, my own honest experience was the further up I went in rank, the worse it got, because I went to a 600th rank undergrad school in the United States. It's like ranked 597th in the nation. Last I checked, it might even be lower than that now. And most of my classes there sucked too, don't get me wrong. But the good classes I had there were better than anything I did in graduate school, 100th ranked school in the nation. And the further up I went, the worse it got. And the further up in terms of my professors' pedigree, the worse it got too, because the most incompetent professors I had PhDs from Berkeley and Oxford and a bunch of other schools I don't give a shit about. Princeton, there's another one. And like the
Harvard
problem
and Yale,
is,
for me.
Yeah, another guy from Yale. And like, I mean, honestly, if somebody with a PhD from Princeton is going to know that, and people will like, I don't know, they'll bow down like when you say that word in people's presence. Like we had a guy from Princeton come speak at campus when I was in grad school, and he spent an hour talking about parking lots. Like he showed us pictures of vacant lots, and he's like, and here they did the impossible. They took pictures of nothing. It's like, no, they did not take pictures of nothing. They took pictures of parking lots. And like, this is the kind of bullshit we like canceled class and rolled out the red carpet for this guy.
That's even worse than watching a dumb movie in place of discussing an important theorist. Yeah. Okay. So maybe the last thing I wanted to get to kind of I tried to approach this same question in different ways. So, the linguistic relativity, and then I guess wanted to get to the talk a little bit about the linguistic turn. And I want to make sure I understand. Now, I was going to read a short introduction on postmodern theory in preparation for this discussion, but I didn't really get the chance to do that. I kind of skimmed through it just to get a basic, very cursory understanding of the linguistic turn. And so I understood it to be, a modern philosophical movement that kind of shifted the emphasis of philosophy to language. And I guess it's a theory or a theoretical movement that insists that we understand um, the world primarily through language, and that that's the way that we make sense of our own subjective experience and culture at large, and that language is also the medium of cognition. And then I guess the central idea is that because language is self-referential, right? And what that means is that we can't define words by referring to like a corresponding object in the world out there. We can only, as people in the past thought, previous philosophers, uh, we can only offer another set of terms to define or the previous words that we used, and so forth, kind of ad infinitum. And so, I guess the linguistic turn is really trying to tell us that there's no getting outside of the web of language, right? Um, and so, yeah, so I guess the whole thing about form is that for you, and that's kind of how I understood the part in your book where you say you contrast the inductive approach of the linguistic turn to the deductive approach of memeology. And I took that to mean that, yeah, forms kind of give themselves to us with a certain immediacy that um, that language doesn't allow. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it.
So, I kind of had my own immediate objections, and maybe they're a bit naive and not so thought out, but I wanted to kind of get your reaction to it. I mean, this idea that language is all there is, and that there's no outside of language. Um, my immediate reaction was, well, I mean, there's lots of different kinds of activity that we engage in, which seems to suggest that there's other kinds of cognitions, that humans are capable of. So I just had the example of like board games, right? When you learn to play simple board games, obviously there's no language that's you don't need language to understand simple board games. Even to learn simple board games, you can just kind of grasp the forms that are being moved, and then the rules that follow. And something similar, I think, could be said of learning to play a musical instrument. I don't know that you really need language to learn a musical instrument or to produce music. And sports. Um, so are those things kind of also examples of? Is that a legitimate way to argue against the linguistic turn?
Yeah, those are really great examples to bring up. And the way that I would put this ultimately in my book that I'm writing right now is that there's different phenomenological registers that have incompatible units of meaning by which they're disclosed. So I mentioned the somatic register, as I call it myself, from the Greek word soma for body, which is the register in which the criteria for intelligibility is just parousia. So at that register, the criteria for understanding it is not linguistic, because the criteria is not a word or a sentence or something like that. It's presence. Now, that is not to say that you can't maybe isomorphically translate that into language, but in order to do that, you have to move from the somatic register, which is kind of the lowest, up to a higher register, which is the linguistic, or I would call that actually the Gnostic in my own terminology, built on the idea that, the Gnostic Gospels, if you look at like Gospel of Philip, there's this big emphasis on language. In the non-canonical Gospel of Philip, the evil archons, or, That's actually in the New Testament too, mistranslated as the princes of the world. But actually in Corinthians, there's also in Greek, the archons crucified Jesus, but they didn't know who he was, whatever. Or whichever epistle that was actually. But, there's this idea that there's the evil spirits, whatever you want to call them. They use language in the Gospel of Philip to deceive people, and they enslave them by giving them the wrong word. And, the Gnostic salvation is built on having the right words. So it's almost like political correctness, in the ancient world. Which you have problems because you have the wrong words. We'll give you the right words, and that's a legitimate register of meaning. That's just the Gnostic register. And the big conflict in early Christianity was what's going to save you. What's the big emphasis? Is it having the right Gnostic contents, or is it just the second coming of Jesus or the second presence of Jesus? Those are different things. Okay, presencing. Which doesn't even have to, by the way, be physically seeing Jesus right now, according to the ancient Christians' view of it. It's just when he presences again, it's going to be a different age. Okay, right. And that's an okay metaphor. Whether you believe in Christianity or not doesn't matter. Everybody. It's a metaphor for the phenomenological criteria of presencing being different from the phenomenological criteria of understanding Gnostic contents. And the other difference is that Gnostic contents, which I prefer that term rather than, I don't want to call the higher layer the linguistic layer. I mean, language is a type of gnosis, just like mathematics is a type of gnosis and logic is a type of gnosis. But, calling it the Gnostic layer reduces them all to the same, I think, transcendental essence, which is that whereas the somatic layer has the minimum unit of meaningfulness as presencing, which is parousia. If you have a substance, in other words, you're going to have parousia emerging from that substance. Okay? That's not sensation, that's not intuition, that's not any of those things. It's just presencing. Okay? And in the Gnostic layer, the criteria is not presence. It's rather minimal unit is value. Okay, so in the Gnostic layer, you have systems, and systems are intelligible at the basis of value, and values are intelligible on the basis, I should say, of their relation to one another. So Ferdinand Saussure mentioned that in linguistics, you have this arbitrariness of the signifier. So in Malayalam, it's ana. In English, it's elephant. It's arbitrary, but it's okay because even with complete arbitrariness, you can have meaning because there's an organization within the system. And that organization can abstractly be considered as one of rank. So the criteria of values distinguished by rank is a Gnostic criteria. It's not that you're viewing two different things so much as you're working within different registers. So you can understand the problem of, say, fossil fuels at the Gnostic layer, and that doesn't generate a new object. You're still dealing with the same object. You're just working with a different transcendental set of criteria. But of course, another one would be the mythic. And the mythic, you're not dealing with values arranged in rank. You're dealing with events which are disclosed, and the minimal unit of meaningfulness, I think, in the mythic layer is an event. And if you think about the story in Hinduism of Lord Brahma creates a woman, I believe her name is Shatarupa, and he falls in love with his own creation. So she moves out of his line of sight. So he responds by generating another head, like I guess here. So now he can see to the side. So she moves behind him, so he generates another head. So she moves again, and he generates a fourth head. So then she climbs up above him, and he generates a fifth head. And then Shiva comes with the sword and slices off the fifth head. And simultaneously limits, I guess, his desire, but also limits where he can be worshipped. I don't know if you're familiar with this story.
Some variation on that. Yeah, I mean, there are many variations that have different moving parts, but based on something like that. Yeah.
it's a very interesting story. As somebody who's much much newer to the system of Hindu myths than yourself. But the reason I'm bringing this up is if you take an event, a mythic event, okay, like Lord Shiva using a sword to slice off Brahma's fifth head, you could decompose that into smaller bits. You could cut it up into pieces. In the same way that you could break down a linguistic unit of meaning into smaller morphemes. So you could take a word in linguistics like uncanny and derive these morphemes, un-can-be. But that's an act of abstraction, and it's secondary because the primordial unit is not the morphemes. You have to artificially generate them. It's the word. And there's some disagreement because the last living oral tradition of epic poetry in Europe, in Yugoslavia in the early 20th century, the anthropologists studied these bards and asked them about the minimal unit of meaning, and they said, well, obviously it's a whole line poetry. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita in Dante. It's the line of poetry. It's not a word. They didn't understand what words are. Okay. And some linguists today still have this debate: is that really makes sense, the traditional grammatical distinction of a word as small as meaning? But anyway, with the Gnostic layer, you have a minimal unit of value, but with the mythic layer, you have a minimal unit of an event. And you could break it up into, Lord Shiva, the sword, the fifth head that's been severed, Lord Brahma, the girl. You could, but that's as secondary as breaking a word into morphemes. So the point I'm making with regard to language is not that language is inferior to these other registers. It's just that it's different. You can't fit the linguistic register into the mythic or the somatic or the memeological. That's another register in which the criteria is shape. Yeah. And once again, you don't have 5 different objects. It's just like Aristotle's categories or Jordan Peterson's construing the world. You don't have another object. You have the same, you have the same world or whatever. You're just moving among different registers. And what you're really finding in the process is that how meaning is transcendently manifested to you is going to be different from one to the next. So I don't know, that was a lot, and it was taken from the book, so I guess it's been in my mind a lot lately. But I guess what do you think of? I mean, did that answer your question? Is a good place to start.
Yeah, and if I understood you correctly, so it's not you're not saying a variation of, I guess, the linguistic turn idea of there's no outside of language. You're not saying that.
Well, let me put it this way, real quick. The linguistic turn is basically the idea there's only one register. Okay, so
there's only one register, right?
Yeah, the linguistic turn would say probably, well, you talk about presencing. Well, no, that's language. You're talking about memes. That's language. You're talking about myth. That's language. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, you're not saying that, but you are saying that there's no such thing as a neutral concept that's not undistorted by the influence of a deep meme, which kind of lends its twist to any shallow meme that you might interpret. So, and actually,
just like there's no myth undistorted, because there's an ordering in which the mythic layer is also higher. So the mythic layer is also influenced by the memes, which are themselves influenced by the somatic presencing. So you also don't have, because the shallow memes that I call in my book, there's really 3 classes. There's the mythic shallow memes, the Gnostic shallow memes, and the sense object shallow memes, which we don't even talk about in this video. But so that's a distinction too, which they are shallow memes, but there's 3 different types.
So then, is the role? I want to ask this question 2 ways. Then, that I'm kind of, I don't know if you've caught this, but I'm kind of just asking the same kind of question, in different ways. I guess so. I have 2 more last questions for you. So, one would be, is philosophy, then the role of philosophy, at least maybe, I don't know, your philosophy or philosophy in general, is the ultimate purpose of it to transcend the bullshit of the of language by kind of revealing or kind of pointing the way, revealing the existence of these other registers. Like I was thinking, like in the book, you introduce Aristotle as an agrarian thinker, and his notion of the circle being a perfect line because it is complete, as an understanding that's informed by the deep meme of the agrarian circle. So we have the example of a philosophical notion being itself a shallow meme. And so this kind of got me thinking about the implications for philosophy as such. And I'm curious about how you see your own philosophical project in this work. You know, is philosophy, is the role of philosophy to provide a potential way to escape the geometrical distortions of any one deep meme, perhaps by, you know, doing what you've just done, which is to kind of reveal the existence of these other registers. And also because, I mean, your book, correct me if I'm wrong, but the project of the book is to kind of is to give a philosophical account of deep memes, and, you know, our present deep meme, or the past deep memes, and possible future deep memes that may arise. And so it's, in a sense, it's a meta study of deep memes and their respective worldviews. So isn't this book evidence that philosophy can help us reach an outside that's independent, or at least point to the other registers? And I don't know, maybe, I mean, this may be a larger question than too large for the scope of that one YouTube live stream, but yeah, I just wanted to mention it as a way of framing my questioning. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Where does this leave philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I have thought about, especially in the course of writing the book. And my response would be that, you know, the five registers of meaning. The one that I haven't talked about in this live stream is you might have heard in some videos talking about, like, countersense objects is what I call them. Like a student loan. Yeah, a student loan is a countersense object because it's a bottomless. That's another one. Yeah, they're countersense objects because you have an object there and it makes sense, but it makes countersense because a student loan is a bottomless pit. No matter how much you pay back, you never get out of it. A machine is basically the promise that, Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Elon Musk. That's the perfect example. Elon Musk is giving us this nonsense that if we burn the remainder of our fossil fuels to go to Mars, we'll get infinite progress. It makes no sense, but people treat him like he's the smartest guy on the earth, right? And it's because the countersense object of Elon Musk is just giving us in linguistic form what the logic or counter logic of a machine already is. The machine as an object already tells you this nonsense that just dump the rest of your energy into this and you'll get infinite progress, which literally is pairing the values of infinity and zero in the same sentence. But we don't think of it that way because when we approach it as an object, we don't explicitly apply it to the type of systematic logic as a Gnostic essence, because we're merely grasping it as an object. And the object makes sense to us only because the deep meme of fossil fuels is reduplicated in it. You take the machine and give it to an agrarian peasant and basically tell them, like, you could, make a lot of vodka from the potatoes and dump it all into a car so you could drive a couple miles, and they'll say, why would I do that? Like, that's not very smart. Like, I'd be better off just eating the potatoes than driving a couple miles. But, like, we take it for granted that it makes sense, but it really only makes sense because it makes sense to us. And that's only because fossil fuels are still present in it. So the level of sense objectivity, machines, student loans, garbage, the idea, well, you can generate tons and tons and tons of garbage every year, and it has no place to go, but you assume that it's still going away if you just put it on a truck. The middle class, the American belief that the middle class is not a class of privilege because it's just everybody, right? It's just everybody. I mean, you're living in a trailer park and driving a pickup truck, and you're still in it the way that you're driving a Rolls Royce and living in, a mansion. You're still in the middle class, as Dmitry Orlov says himself. No matter who you ask, they're all going to say, well, we're just middle class. But that's a universal class with a huge outside. Okay, but it's still portrayed as the universal class. There's no outside to it, even though there is. So where I think philosophy fits in is philosophy fits in at the level of not of deep memes, but it fits in at the level of sense objectivity, more than systematicity. Because if you have somebody who's exclusively occupied with mythology, like Homer or Virgil or Dante, they're working strictly at the level of disclosing events, and they're very good at that. Okay, and our lives mostly occur at that level. And then you have the very good systematizers, like the physicists at some department who are doing a lot of rigorous systematic work without necessarily having to think about the deeper foundation of that progress. They just collect their paycheck, they do their scientific work, they're very good at it, but they're doing systematic work. They're focusing exclusively with values in the system. And then deeper than that, you have the sense objective layer, which a lot of people don't think at that layer because it's a lot more abstract. Okay, I think that Oswald Spengler's civilizations are sense objects. They're not deep memes. The Magian worldview of a layer, the Faustian worldview of the cathedral, the ancient Greek worldview of the statue, the ancient Egyptian worldview of the mummy, those are sense objects. And if you have a mummy, if you have a mummy, you have the ancient Egyptian idea of the past. Just like if you have a Greek statue, you have the Greek view of time. And those are very different views. But you don't need this huge system to get that. You get it with the object. If you have a machine, you have our worldview, as dysfunctional as it is. So I think philosophy occurs at the level of sense objectivity because all of the great philosophers tended to see the world with a certain, I don't want to call it a shape, with a certain object, which served as a prototype. So every great philosopher has one. Plato had the realm of ideas, which is the idea, basically, pun intended, that the basis of understanding imperfect contents is the perfect content. And the perfect content is basically like a statue that is existing in another realm with the type of fixed objectivity. So for him, the form or the idea in the other world is his sense object. For Hegel, it's the notion. Everything's understood in terms of notion, as he understands it as something what I would call sense object. For Kant, it's the transcendental subject is the sense object. For Heidegger, it's the clearing, right? For Husserl, it's perfect intuition. For Wittgenstein, it's language, but language as understood as this type of objective thing that you have to understand explicitly. So Wittgenstein wasn't that good, actually, at understanding language at the well, let me put it this way. He problematized language because in a lot of ways it didn't make sense to him to just use it naively the way we do, because for him it was made into an object explicitly, and then he sort of universalized that into the way to understand everything. But for Wittgenstein, it's a sense object. For Zizek, it's the gap and all of this stuff about incompleteness, etc. And you get the basic idea. And I would say that in a lot of ways, philosophy is just reaching down to the level of sense objectivity and trying to find the skeleton key that can understand everything else. So if you're Hegel, you think you can go back to the ancient Hindus and all of the other, and Martin Luther, and the ancient philosophers, and you have this key to understand them because you have the ultimate sense object, which is the notion. And that is in a lot of ways what philosophy is finding the sense object and then trying to use it to understand everything. And that works for stuff above it, but that's not the deepest layer. deeper than that is the deep meaning. And it's not a coincidence that you could have a diversity at the level of sense objects with the same deep meaning. So Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Plato, Descartes, they're all agrarian thinkers. Just like Jordan Peterson, Slavoj Žižek, Bertrand Russell, they're all fossil fuel thinkers. Okay, and it's not enough to say that he's a fossil fuel thinker to know everything about them. And obviously, that's not even what I would argue in my book. I would say it's a very abstract level of structure. And there's other layers, but you can say that there's something about Peterson's thought which is missing from Thomas Aquinas, because when asked about what his solution to the student loan crisis, which he acknowledges exists, was Peterson's view was, well, we're just investing right now to build an online alternative to college, and it'll cost 1% the total cost of college. So, if tuition's $50,000 a year, you could imagine 1% of 50,000 would still be enough money to make it worth his time, because that would still be a pretty large amount of money. But I mean, that just shows that even, I'll admit, one of the better thinkers alive today is still enslaved to this view that, well, obviously the future is everybody learning on a computer, because the energy for that's going to just go on and on. He mentioned once, he said that, the cable companies are going out of business because so many people are switching to YouTube, and nobody knows how the future of that's going to work. To which I say, well, maybe in the short term, but in the long term, I know exactly how that's going to work, is that eventually the fossil fuels are not going to continue to support everybody watching YouTube all the time. And I've realized the irony of saying that live on YouTube at the moment, but I realized my own videos someday are not going to be anymore. So I don't know. I just mentioned a lot. What do you think of that? And did that kind of answer what you were looking for?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the answer is no, philosophy cannot escape the but working at the level of sense objects, you're able to reveal the other registers that we work at, right? So I guess I don't know. Is that the one line answer? I know it's hard to reduce complicated things, but so you have.
I mean, I think it is possible. I think it is possible to get to the lower levels, and I think that you have to exercise extreme caution. So the biggest challenge, real quick, with writing the book, the reason it's been delayed is I realized I had to do I just had to reread Being in Time by Heidegger cover to cover all over again. So I haven't been doing videos as much lately because I've been just going through Being in Time all over again. And it really is one of the most difficult books, ever written. But I realized, like, Heidegger would not do what I do, because he would say you're making a fundamental mistake if you think that somatic presencing is the lowest layer, because he would consider that to be one ontic concern against the ontological structures of Dasein. But I would argue that if you just stick with the ontological structures of Dasein as, care, concern, attunement, understanding, all of these things that he mentions, you're going to miss, I think, the fact that at the deepest level, you don't just have this basic constitution of Dasein. I would argue at the basis level of this hierarchy, you have something, which is presencing. And the most difficult part of the book is, like, how am I going to, do justice to Heidegger's valid critique of that position, while still insisting, as I do, that, if you want to get out of doing philosophy just as one sense object, you have to go all the way to the bottom of that hierarchy, in which all you'll find is raw somatic parousia and presencing. But that is not at all like this Marxist, reduction to material. That's not materialism. It's not the material modes of production. It's something radically different, but it's still the deepest thing you'll find in that hierarchy.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reading I have to do, because I have not read Heidegger. And as I mentioned, I gave you I know you don't like Spark Notes versions, but I had to get some kind of, even just cursory understanding of this stuff to be able to say something intelligent. So yeah, I mean, I have a lot of reading to do. I think, it would be interesting to, as I progress in my reading, to maybe come back to some of these ideas, at a later time, kind of revisit it. It, as I read people like Heidegger and you mentioned Husserl. When I first asked you, is Aristotle the most central thinker? You said yes, and also increasingly Husserl as well. So, um,
yeah, and I think that Husserl and Heidegger are really interesting to read in line together, because in a lot of ways, you're not finding necessarily with Heidegger a negation of those original phenomenological ideas. So in Heidegger, you still have that emphasis on, he talks about the essential this and that of Dasein. So you still have some notion of getting to essence, but it's radically different, but still really great. I mean, I would totally recommend, like, if you get your hands sometime on a copy of Being in Time, that'll have a lifetime worth of value, because I mean, definitely that's the type of thing which you don't just read once and like, oh, well, we're done. Like I had one viewer who says he rereads it once every year, and he's in retirement age.
Yeah, no, I have the same kind of mentality. I mean, reading this stuff is very difficult. I even found De Anima to be a difficult read, because there's a lot of moving parts. But I'm definitely of the mindset that if you read a philosophical work, you're going to have to. For me, my rule of thumb is a minimum of 3 reads. If you really want to win good ideas from any text, you've got to just got to read it the first time, just to kind of gauge the difficulty of it. Just get the gist of the general gist of the text, and then the second and third readings, you start to get a better understanding of the ideas, and then you kind of place it into a larger framework of understanding. So yeah, and we've been talking about you've been pushing Nietzsche recently, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be, it's hard to say. Like, I haven't read Heidegger. I'm not too familiar with the concepts that you mentioned, like Dasein. And I'm not sure whether I'm ready to dive into those texts, but I do remember reading like Nietzsche, and yeah, that may be a thinker that's that I'll probably be better able to grasp at this stage in my journey into philosophy. So yeah, what do you think about our future discussions and dialogues? Where we
Well,
could.
yeah, I definitely think that it's there's a lot of good ground covered, and I definitely appreciate you bringing a lot of good questions to the discussion today. Those were some great things to think about, and your reading of De Anima was very productive in finding these sort of these really good passages within the text. So that was great. I would say that if you want to do Nietzsche or anything, I mean, as far as the next time or whatever, I think that would. I mean, I'm open to whatever you have in mind, and if Uhud would like to join us for the Nietzsche thing, she said she would consider that. So we'll see. It'll be really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, we could even kind of vary the format and actually, sit with the text, maybe do something like that. And yeah, it's interesting. I was also thinking about your presentation on Sadhguru's book. That was actually the first book that you suggested that we read for these for our first dialogue, and we never got around to it. But you did do a presentation, and I did have some interesting ideas about comparing maybe ancient Greek philosophy to kind of continuing where you left off in that presentation, and talking about there are really interesting parallels between ancient Hindu philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy. even like I watched your lecture on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and you mentioned how he's more willing to organize things into an ordered list, and it made me think about, like, so you talked about like what the good life means, and like that list, that ordered list of, at the bottom you have sensual pleasures, and then you have politics, and then contemplative life is the highest, right? And what it's really interesting, because in the the form basic aims of Hindu life kind of pretty much correspond to that. It's very interesting. So at the bottom you have kama, which is pleasure, and everybody knows that from the Kama Sutra, right? So you have
That's a text
sensual.
I have.
Oh yeah, okay.
So
I've never.
no, we haven't discussed.
Yeah. And then the level above that is artha, which is politics and wealth. And so those things are, taken together, material prosperity and politics. But higher above that is this concept of dharma, or duty. Duty to one's family, to one's friends, to society at large. So it's not a perfect match between the Aristotelian concepts of the good life, but it is interesting. You do have a similar kind of ordering, and then the last stage is actually moksha, or spiritual liberation. And I guess that's where we see a difference between these two ancient modes of thought, because for Hindus, moksha is basically, and you mentioned this as well, the transcendence of forms. So yeah, that would be, I think, an interesting thing, because you're beginning to read more into Hindu philosophy as well, and I would say we're kind of at the same level in terms of exploring this stuff. So yeah, I think that would be interesting to kind of comparing ancient Greek thought to Hindu philosophy.
Enough, but nicely enough, the Wi-Fi box, which I'll just go ahead and show right now, that did not was sufficiently charged. So this little thing, which has had problems with dying before, but this was sufficiently charged, so we're still talking for. I thought we were only going to have about an hour today to talk, but yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. You mentioned that spiritual liberation is at the top of the old Hindu hierarchy, and I think that Aristotle was really at the top of, at least in the Politics, which is basically the sequel of the Ethics. I think that some really old scholarship says they were actually like the same book, basically. They're just two different parts of the same book. In the Politics, he mentions that if you have a pursuit of happiness which is contingent on other people, it's going to be less perfect than one which is not contingent on anything except your sort of your own pursuit of it. So what that means is, if you have desire for something like success in a corporation, well, there's a lot of other people that's going to be contingent on, okay? And you're going to be at the mercy of those people. Yeah. But if your happiness is dependent upon philosophy, that's the highest kind of happiness, because there's nothing there required except the mind contemplating the highest truths. It's not even like food. Like, you desire food, you have to actually be dependent on the existence of that food. You want to eat goat, for example, for dinner. You kind of need a goat, to physically exist to do that. But with philosophy, you can just think abstractly. So it's interesting. I'm not saying it's the same as spiritual liberation, but it's interesting that the Greeks would say that, obtaining like wisdom or knowledge is the highest. But for the Hindus, it's probably not quite that simple, right?
No, yeah, because the philosophy, I think, is included in the third level, right? So you have kama, pleasure, you have artha, wealth, and politics, and then you have dharma, which dharma includes the contemplative life, I think. Like the particular tradition that I'm most interested in is for that philosophy is actually the highest path to transcendence, but it's a tool rather than an end in itself. And the only thing that's truly an end in itself is spiritual liberation, which is philosophy is the highest path to enlightenment, but again, it's a path, it's a tool. And spiritual liberation is something entirely different. It's beyond those kinds of constructions, I guess. Or
well, what would it look like if you obtain that? So you mentioned the concept of Dhamma, and that's something which is maybe a little easier to grasp, because in the Ramayana, the one interpretation is the difference between Ram and Ravana is they both have access to this sort of body of Hindu philosophy, right? And wisdom or knowledge, let's just call it that. But Ravana abuses it to try to exploit people, whereas Ram doesn't use it for his own purposes. He does his ethical duty to other people. And that's much easier to understand. But I mean, is there like a narrative about somebody who embodies this principle of spiritual liberation?
Oh, I mean, there's some, but the Buddha, right?
Yeah.
The Buddha, well, in a sense, like the gods themselves are subordinate to, or the deities are, that's not the highest principle in Hinduism. I guess one way of putting it would be, for instance, Shiva, or Krishna, or all these different deities, they must themselves speak liberation, and they are divine beings only because they've figured out the path to enlightenment themselves.
And for Shiva, is the stillness of meditation, is that him trying to get it, or is that him when he's got it?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it's both. It's meditation. I mean, there are different levels. So when you're on that journey, you are meditating, but you're not. You haven't broken all of the holds that culture and nature have on you. And once you break those holds, then yes, the stillness of meditation is synonymous with enlightenment. At least that's my understanding. And even because you don't save meditation for when you're, it's not exactly synonymous with enlightenment or liberation from the world. It's when you start out, you meditate, and when you become enlightened, you're still meditating. It's just that same practice leads you to a state where none of what's going on around you touches that aspect of yourself that is already free from forms. One interesting thing is that another term that a common term for forms for the world in Hinduism is nama rupa. And nama rupa, literally translated, nama is name. It's cognate with the English term name, and rupa is, you mentioned, the tale of Brahma sprouting heads to watch this woman. I think the last of her name was Rupa, right? Rupa just means form.
Shata.
Yeah.
So she was.
Shata,
well, what is Shata? Yeah, in Sanskrit, what is Shata?
Shata, I don't know. I'm more familiar with the tale about Ushas that you mentioned in the Shiva presentation, the primordial woman, but I'm not too familiar with the myth that you mentioned today. But the
and
point
I
was
might be getting the name wrong too.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's easy because Usha is actually Usa is my aunt has that name, so a lot of these names, I have family members who have these names. So,
so Nepal is Sanskrit based, right? Nepali, right?
yeah, Nepali is probably even closer to Sanskrit than Hindi Urdu, because Hindi Urdu, well, Nepal is a landlocked country, and it's closer to Sanskrit because it's borrowed less from Persian and Arabic than Hindi Urdu. Although it does borrow more from like the Tibetan, Burmese languages that are in Nepal. Nepal has so many different languages, and because it borrows from those, that's why there isn't. It's funny, there isn't mutual intelligibility between Hindi and Nepali because of that. Because we have certain forms that just makes it impossible for Indians to understand us.
Probably actually more intelligibility. Well, definitely more intelligibility with Urdu from Pakistan, right? And with Nepal.
Oh, I mean, well, Urdu, no, because Urdu's even borrows even more from Persian and Arabic than Hindi does.
No, I mean that somebody who speaks Hindi will be able to understand somebody from Pakistan. I mean, they're the same language, right?
Yeah, they're essentially the same language. There's a little bit more borrowed, I guess, from Persian and Arabic and Urdu, and the writing system is this derived from Arabic. But yeah, Nepali is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, closer to Sanskrit because of its isolation, being a landlocked country. But I guess the point I was trying to make was this world of the world is actually identified as Namarupa, name and form. That's how this world is to be understood, as an amalgamation of names and forms, and the whole point is to go beyond that, and to basically dissolve forms into. I mean, so Sadhguru's book is kind of strange. I mean, I feel like he has his own idiosyncratic way of putting things when he talks about the ultimate reality being a void. That seems more Buddhist than Hindu. But I mean, he has these like idiosyncratic ways of formulating Hindu, what's already an orthodox understanding. I don't know if that makes sense, but like he uses different terms.
Yeah, I thought, to be honest with you, that the emphasis on nothing sounded more like contemporary Western philosophy, because if you read Zizek, for example, you'll have this weird, meditation on, on nothing and then what's less than nothing and such. And yeah, it was strange to see something almost a little bit like that. I don't know if he's been influenced by Western philosophy, but it seemed like he might be, right?
That's a good question. I haven't explored Sadhguru too much, but he has some interesting formulations. I think it felt like a combination of Buddhist, like he talks about shunya, and shunya is a concept that's more associated with Buddhism, or in Buddhism it's called shunyata. And actually that's where the modern Nepali word for zero comes from too. Zero in Nepali is shunya, and I believe in Urdu and Hindi too. So, it seems like he's kind of merging Buddhist and Hindu understandings, and then like even his reading of the levels of existence. So stula, and then sukshma. And then shunya, but then he places Shiva as beyond all of those things. I mean, his terminology is different, but he's not really deviating from Hindu orthodoxy, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely interesting. I know that he's a bit of a controversial figure because some people I know who live in India will share occasionally on social media that the controversy about him is he emphasizes maybe spiritually being detached from material objects, and yet he's got a pretty decent material fortune himself, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent that's true or not. I mean, I'm not in India. I'm not so close to Indian politics, or he could be a cult of personality. I don't know. It's very hard to say from a distance,
Sure.
But
well,
yeah.
I was just going to say that we have quite a few comments that that we've been getting this whole time. I guess that I neglected to check it because of I was sitting outside and there was I was holding everything, so it wasn't easy to move around. But now I'm back inside. Just kind of go through these comments, and maybe
Sure, yeah.
we could both kind of see how we could respond to it. So, all right.
Yeah,
so
I think we've neglected the comments on every video, so I think it's time we got around to them. Yeah.
Well, one reason I'm cautious about it is I was live streaming with Becky Noodle from Northern Ireland, and we just started the discussion, and there was this really terrible feedback from the microphone. So I guess I thought that it was caused by having the window open at the same time that I was streaming. It might have just been maybe some problem with maybe her microphone or my microphone. I don't know, because I don't think it happened ever again. But definitely, yeah, we'll do better. But looks like David said Zizek mentions the Holy Spirit as the presence of God, and when there's love between brothers, the Holy Spirit is there. So that is the second coming. God is dead otherwise. So in other words, the second coming, which Paul mentioned, the second parousia, has already happened, according to Zizek. And that's not exactly something to negate the concept of parousia, right?
Yeah, I think he's interesting. He has an interesting interpretation of Christianity because, so he says that like when Christ died on the cross, God literally died, and the Holy Spirit is all that we have left, and that's Holy Spirit means the community of believers. And he says when Christ asks, why have you forsaken me? He's literally signaling the death of God as this transcendent thing, and pointing towards God and as Holy Spirit as the community of believers. So he has a very talking about idiosyncratic takes on religion. He says that Christianity is a path to atheism, to true atheism. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think that I was writing down today. I was just sort of jotting down, influences for my book, and one of them is the New Testament in Koine Greek, and also the non-canonical Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels like Philip, but other Peter is a Docetic gospel, portrays Jesus as more of a spirit than a physical body, whatever. But I think that a lot of that stuff gets neglected by philosophers, because a lot of philosophers will have a bias of, well, there's nothing interesting in Christianity. That's just some religion of the ignorant or whatever. But it's really not true. And I think Zizek is such an interesting philosopher, and Peterson too. They're so interesting because they tap into this potential which Christianity has. I mean, if you are willing to just maybe mine it for intellectually interesting stuff, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I think all great traditions should be approached with the same mindset, right? I mean, you just have. This is what I was trying to get at the beginning of this discussion is, let's not be so quick to dismiss people who are trying to make sense of the world with nothing but their own intellectual faculties. I think that's a very impoverished way to approach religion, mythology, or any other kind of cultural, you know, any other aspect of culture. So
Right. And
tradition is a source of, is a way of passing down knowledge, right? It's if nothing else, even if you're a totally secular person, I think you have to approach tradition as a rich repository of knowledge rather than just a record of past mistakes and errors.
right. And we have the solution, I think, today, especially that, all of the added complexity in the sciences, which admittedly has happened. I think we have this tendency, excuse me, to misread that as though all of us have done it. And we really haven't. And even if, I always talk about the fallacy, like, Mark Zuckerberg gets credit for processing the data for 2 billion Facebook users, but he doesn't. He's not crunching those numbers with his brain. He's making machines do it. And we have the same problem with all of us. Like, we think we're all so much smarter than the past just because there's technology around us, which is very complicated. But actually, a lot of our own thought process is much simpler, vastly more simpler.
Yeah, because we're just deferring to authority. Again, we thought this, but we now know that is embodies that spirit perfectly. Like, you haven't done. We're not smarter than Aristotle because we have a smartphone. I mean, we're literally just pressing buttons on a screen, whereas he's, as he says, trying to reveal the ground of everything that he's asserting, which is a complicated process, and there's a lot of moving parts, and we're not willing to go through the hard work of going and scrutinizing all of those moving parts. We just kind of like to we're in a permanent mode of making assertions without underlying their basis, that they're understanding the basis of those assertions.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And even like 100 years ago, the textbooks in school were more difficult than they are now. But I'll go ahead, Fish, going through these comments real quick. Before the battery really does die on this Wi-Fi box. David also said,
I'm surprised this lasted.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah, I'm surprised too. Well, it was charging like for a while before I turned it on. So I guess, if you charge it sufficiently, it'll be able to last maybe a couple hours. But David also says the singularity of desire. If you follow Lacan, you can make signifiers return to you in new forms. I'd have to think about that to understand it. But Francisco replied to that. The singularity at the heart of a black hole would literally be void in space, but I'm probably not saying anything helpful. So I think that was when we were talking about Aristotle and the void. Yeah, it's a void, but it has a huge effect on the space around it. So it's not just mere void. Alexander says, well, actually not Alexander. Law Hexander says hello, and somebody says hi to him. And how long will this be going on? Until Chad's internet breaks. In the beginning.
I hope your audience understands with all these jargon-laden questions. I'm not terribly well read in philosophy, so I have no idea what you're talking about half the time. So, yeah.
You mean the comments, or?
Yeah. No, nothing. Yeah, the comments. Yeah, those kinds of questions will have to be taken by Chad, not me.
Well, I'll just say it this way: is if you're talking about I don't know, the void in the singularity in physics, thank you for bringing that up. But I think that it's relevant, but I think that Aristotle's view of there not being maybe a void in the world in a type of epistemological sense, that could still be valid, even if we accept modern physics views about the void. So, in the beginning was the word. Elon Musk is a great science man. He must be correct. Really? Elon Musk is a guy,
That sounds
and
like a
I'm saying this.
sarcastic comment.
Oh, I know. I'm saying
Okay.
this to all the people who actually would say that in the media. Elon Musk, who made his money on PayPal. PayPal is a program that runs on a computer. That's not like discovering anything in chemistry or astronomy or biology. Like there's this equivocation, and obviously this what this person is pointing out. There's this equivocation. Like, is Mark Zuckerberg like Galileo? No, because he's a guy who uses machines to make himself a lot of money. And I understand, like, there's complexity with regard to running Facebook. But to say, I mean, it's ridiculous, it's preposterous to say that it's as intellectually rigorous to run Facebook as it is to like actually do the work that Isaac Newton did with being accountable to nature. Those are different things. But you have this guy who he's indistinguishable to the media from somebody who is a real scientist like Isaac Newton, right?
Yeah, you know, I mentioned to you in I think in a private message that like in my own community, I feel like modern civilization has kind of hijacked the Hindu reverence for learning and knowledge, and now instead of thinking about like past thinkers and holding them up as the highest level that you can reach with your intellect, we're looking towards professors and you know, we're in awe of kids who win spelling bees and math competitions. I mean, and
I know
people like Mark Zuckerberg, which is so absurd. It's like they're profaning knowledge. They're using it merely for material gain, whereas you know, knowledge is supposed to be a path to transcendence in ancient thinking.
yeah, and most people, even who are maybe studying the the rigorous fields in education, are not actually being learned to think rigorously. So Dmitry Orlov, who was an engineer, mentioned that if he had, since he was educated in Russia, if he had a Russian professor, even in America, he would always do much better in class than if he had an American professor, because the American professor would just tell you what's going to be on the final exam. And the students, and I know this from teaching college myself, all they want to know is what's going to be on the final. Okay. But the Russian professor would actually prepare him better, because the Russian professor would show him the foundational reasons why. So it's a difference in approach, like Euclid. Euclid is not how we teach mathematics today, because Euclid gives you a set of axioms and a set of rules, and you get more and more and more complicated results from following those rules. And that's not the way we teach mathematics now. And like one of my professors, my philosophy professor in undergrad, said, we don't have a mathematics department here. We have a calculation department. And a lot of people's own testimony is that, like, you know, if you want to succeed there, you have to just get a tutor who's like a professional engineer to teach you how to just do the calculations. And, you know, these are the people who, I'll admit, it's impressive the level of, you know, quantitative number crunching they can do. Many of them are still not learning the foundations, or they're not busying themselves, I should say, with foundations. That's how you can get into the kinds of errors that Elon Musk makes of, well, obviously we won't be able to inhabit the Earth because of pollution, so we should just pollute the atmosphere even more by flying on a space shuttle to Mars. And then, you know, what do we do when we get there? Because it's going to require how much fossil fuels to make Mars inhabitable, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's also a symptom of over specialization, right? If you're just working on something so very small and obscure and in your own discipline, in order for you to do that, you have to basically take for granted all of what led up to that understanding, and also all the other sciences that inform your own science, right? So as a biologist, you're not going through all the understanding that all the knowledge that a chemist has access to. You're just kind of taking that for granted. And the same thing with physics. If you're a biologist, you kind of have to take all of these things for granted, and all of this knowledge just comes to you in a textbook, and you're just kind of supposed to take it for granted, and then go from there. Whereas, I think that's just the nature of specialized knowledge. And maybe philosophy is one of the only disciplines that escapes that, where you can go through everything that Aristotle went through to get to his conclusions. And yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing you got to keep in mind is you could have the best minds working on something, and there will still be a lot more that they will. So pharmaceutical drugs, you mentioned biology, you could have the best minds in the country producing some pharmaceutical drug, which is still going to have side effects that they didn't envision. And when the people take that drug and suffer the side effects, it's just collateral damage. It's the same thing with pesticides. I mean, Monsanto is despicable, but it would be wrong to say that the people working there are stupid, because obviously they're very intelligent in a linear way. But the side effects of those pesticides and the long-term effect it's going to have in North America of starving millions of people, which I'll just say that's what any rational person would have to conclude from sterilizing all of our farmland, which is literally what we're doing purposefully. It would be wrong to say that the people who engineered that system are stupid, okay? But it's still going to have side effects that they didn't anticipate. And the more that they up the toxicity of the pesticides to kill more and more weeds, and the more and more that the weeds will just evolve around it, the more it's actually going to hurt us. And that's the game that you agree to play when you do this nonsense, because Ted Kaczynski talks about the complexity and emergent factors, right? He says that no matter how well you think you understand the system, if you understand the system as like a linear system rather than a complex system, you're going to be misled to understand that an emergent property is precisely what it was not predicted, because that's the difference between complexity and these more naive use of systems. And the reason I'm bringing this up is no matter how smart you are, an unpredictable thing is by definition unpredictable. So you won't be able to foresee all of the effects that it has.
Right. And well, so there's that. There's the problem of no matter how smart you are, you're not going to be able to deal with a complex system, being only one agent, able to control a very small aspect of whatever you're working on. But there's also, I think knowledge in the past has always implied a certain like self-reflexive quality, whereas now it's just memory. How much you can accumulate, how much you've accumulated, and what kind of prestige that brings you, what kind of title that brings you. So yeah, I think we have a very strange sense of what it means to be knowledgeable. Like, knowledgeable should mean that you have a certain self-reflexive quality. You can kind of step back from whatever it is you're engaged in and kind of gain a meta perspective on it. That's not what we mean when we say, oh, that person is learned or knowledgeable. We just means that he's, if he's a scholar of Shakespeare, that he's read all of Shakespeare, and that he understands all of Shakespeare's work. But does he understand why Shakespeare is important, or does he understand his own project of trying to understand Shakespeare?
And increasingly, we're actually just funneling the money to people who are not even contemplating something as interesting or as worthy, I should say, of their attention as Shakespeare. At this point, we're just funneling money to people like Elon Musk, who are just basically telling us that we can keep being consumers. Because honestly, anybody who gets excited about Elon Musk, do they picture living on Mars to be anything except the equivalent of living in either some suburb in North America or maybe they're a little more trendy than that. They'll picture it being like Manhattan, right? They just picture like putting New York City on the moon, right?
Yeah, I don't know why everybody's enamored with this city, but the only thing good about it is the jazz scene. That's about it. Otherwise, this place is irredeemable.
Yeah, and no offense, I know you're a New Yorker, but I'm just saying, like they're not picturing it being like a rural village in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
They're picturing it being a very flashy place with a lot of stuff
Yeah.
going on, and they still get to be consumers and all that. And if Elon Musk was telling people that they'd have to live on Mars the way that lower class people live on Arrakis and Dune, nobody would be excited about that.
No, certainly not. Yeah.
Oh, we got a few more comments. Let's see. Interesting thing about the early Indus Valley civilization where Buddhism originated is that they never built statues. Also, their cities were built on grid level without a center. So, yeah, I have a comment on that, Flowers, about Indus Valley civilization and Buddhism. I'll admit myself, I don't know anything about that.
That's such a broad thing. I only have a vague understanding of that, but I think you're referring to the Harappan civilization. I don't know if the commenter is still around, but if that's what you're talking about, I mean, the Indus Valley seal, right, is apparently is the first, one of the earliest depictions of Shiva as this three-headed figure who's in like a meditative pose with. And that may be the incarnation of Shiva as Pashupati, or the Lord of beasts. And so, I mean, that's clearly an icon. It may not be a sculpture, but I believe there are sculptures. There are three-dimensional images. So I'm not sure what the commenter is referring to.
So Hinduism does go all the way back to Indus Valley?
That's what some people are claiming, and that seal from the Indus Valley River, the Indus Valley civilization, is the earliest, or one of the earliest depictions of Shiva that we have. We have this seal that still hasn't really been deciphered, of this figure kind of sitting in a meditative pose, and he has like a headdress. If you want to look that up, but yeah, so that some people are claiming that that's the earliest depiction of Shiva. What I'm trying to say is that we have images. This is a culture that dealt with images. So I'm not sure what he means by, but this didn't create any images.
Well, it's very anomalous for a culture to prohibit images because of the magical significance. I mean, like John Michael Greer, as a practicing mage, mentions, like, if you're gonna, let me put it this way: if you're gonna do magic, you pretty well need some sort of image. And people engage in magic without realizing it with regard to the images and like advertising, for example, is black magic. And there was also the controversy before Hillary Clinton was elected of some internet subcultures were performing black magic. It was interesting. They wanted. Do you remember the day that Hillary Clinton collapsed in public?
Yeah, I remember that vaguely. Yeah.
Okay. Did you know that some people were performing black magic to make Hillary Clinton collapse in public before it happened?
I'm gonna say no, but I have a feeling you mean something different, but than the common understanding of that term.
Well, so one of the things Greer brings up is like, this stuff really works. It's like TSRW. It's one of the principles for people who dabble in magic. They realize, like, this stuff really works, and that is something which. So I'm bringing up images because there is like a magical value which people, it's required to do good magic. So it's very rare to actually ban them. And like the cultures that do that, like in Islam, for example, you go to a mosque, you're not going to see images of anything because it's prohibited. And in India, where we have this pretty clean religious diversity, more religious diversity, I should say, than in the United States, you do have images at the icon store, which are sold to Muslims, which contain words written in Arabic, which, I don't know what it says, but like, I guess you'll put the words up on the wall because it's not an image.
Right. So did that commenter follow up? I'm really curious because in Indus Valley civilization, I'm not sure what he meant by that. And does Buddhism go back that far? I don't know.
Yeah, the commenter's still here. It says that I think my point is an anon phallic civilization. I don't know if that means an anonymous phallic or maybe that's a typo. A non-phallic. Okay, there we go.
Oh,
A non-phallic civilization with no big monuments. So, do you agree with that analysis of the Indus Valley civilization, or whichever one you were talking about?
I mean, I have no idea what that means because, like, Buddhist stupas, are they non-phallic? I mean, they're round. I don't, I don't, I'm not sure what phallic means. Like, if that's like psychoanalytic or like Lacanian terminology. Like I said, I'm not that well read. Your
Yeah, I
viewer
think that
assume that.
Yeah, I think there's a like a psychoanalytic context because right before that he says the master does not have the knowledge, the slave has the knowledge in the master-slave discourse. There's more psychoanalytic references, which that's more my interest, but it's relevant here. Yeah, definitely agree that it's relevant. And there's also a comment about. Hey, let's try to get up here real quick. So somebody said read Dreyfus for Heidegger. That's a good place to start. I'll agree with that. He's controversial in the Hubert Dreyfus, the professor at Berkeley. That was actually the first Heidegger lectures I listened to back in like 2010. That was the only stuff on. It wasn't on YouTube back then. It was actually on iTunes U. He would have the lectures from Berkeley on Heidegger on iTunes U, and that's how I first read Being in Time. But the caution about Dreyfus is he tends to read it more in ways that will please his fellow rationalists at Berkeley. And he was at MIT before then, which is he's going to try to read it as like this account of human behavior, which is non-computerized. What that means is Dreyfus is going to emphasize the stuff in Heidegger about, you never just go into a room and process information like you're an AI machine, because he was the thorn in the side of the AI people at MIT at his first job back in the 70s or whatever. They had this belief like we're going to develop a perfect AI replica of the human mind, and he would always say, well, you can't do that because in Being in Time, Heidegger says that, blah, blah, blah is non-computerized. And that's true. But with Dreyfus, you have the danger of wanting too much to speak in a way that people like that can understand. So I would say definitely listen to Dreyfus, but also read some other perspectives which are not explicitly formulated to be listened to by MIT AI people.
I had one interesting thing that came to mind with respect to that previous comment about non-phallic Buddhism. If I could just speak on that for a second.
Yeah, this would be great to hear.
Yeah, so one interesting thing is, I don't know if you've ever been to a Hindu temple, a Shaivite temple, that with where Shiva is the main deity. But usually, like I'm about to go to temple after this actually, and when I step into the temple, the first thing I do is go to a linga, a Shiva linga. And a linga is basically, literally, you can say it's Shiva's phallus, right? But
yeah, that's one interpretation.
Right, and it sits on a yoni, which is supposed to symbolize the womb. But linga also literally means sign. It literally means sign. And so, yeah, I mean, in a sense, Buddhism, the goal is to get beyond forms, right? Is to basically dissolve, get to shunyata, which is the absence of all signs and forms, nama rupa, right? Names are also signs. And so I guess you could say that Buddhism is non-phallic in that way, in that there's no central signs or in both senses of the term, I guess. There isn't an actual phallic depiction, but there's also no signs at the center to. That's not what you're trying to reach. You're trying to go beyond all signs. I don't know. That may be a possible interpretation.
Because in Buddhism you can't obtain enlightenment from a sign or a symbol. You have to actually go directly to it. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, I mean, you have to clearly understand how language is used, as long as you're going to use language and concepts. But yeah, the ultimate goal is to get beyond all signs. There's whereas in Hinduism, it's, a sign can be a tool right up until the end. Whereas in Buddhism, I feel like from the outset you're trying to go beyond signs, and yeah.
Well, I think maybe one example is, there's some languages, and I don't want to offend anybody who's from another one of these religions if I'm misinterpreting or misportraying it, but I think that there are some religions where taking an oath linguistically is a big deal. So in Islam, you take the Shahada, if I remember that word correctly, in which you say, in Arabic, I think you have to say it in Arabic, according to a Palestinian woman, not Uhud, another girl from that region, from the West Bank. I think she said it has to be in Arabic, and there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet, whatever, that you take the Shahada. And you can't be a Muslim without taking the Shahada. And you also can't be a Muslim without saying it the right way. It's not like accepting Jesus as your savior, where you kind of personally make it up. It's like you actually take an oath linguistically, and it matters. But that's a perfectly valid concept for Islam, but it's not. You don't have the Buddhist version of that, where you obtain enlightenment or whatever by pronouncing something symbolic, right?
No, because even the Buddha's pronouncements are merely tools which you have to abandon. The Buddha is not the highest principle. His teachings are not the highest principle. They're merely tools that allow you to, cross the other side, so to speak. So they're not sacred or divine. They're not. Yeah, they're not imbued with some kind of sacred quality by themselves. It's only valuable insofar as it gets you to the beyond.
So it's almost in Buddhism as though there's a difference between like the Gnostic register and something else. Like you won't find salvation by remaining in that particular way of construing meaning.
Right. And actually the same, and that goes for Hinduism too, at least the traditions that I'm most familiar with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I really need to learn a lot more. Like, I mean, when I was in Thailand, which is the only place I've been in my life, I think, where Buddhism is really explicitly out in the open, is Thailand. I think Sri Lanka is also a Buddhist country, but I might not have been in the Buddhist part of Sri Lanka, because I think most people that I saw were still Hindus in Colombo. I mean, there were Buddhist monks in Kandy, for example, which is deeper in the island. But in Colombo, it feels just like being in India, because I remember we were in Colombo and my wife would give instructions in Tamil to the taxi drivers. And they would take us where we needed to go, and they asked us, they asked her questions like at the coffee shop in Tamil. Which is great. I have a wife who speaks Tamil when we're in Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu and the parts of Kerala where they speak Tamil. And then when we're anywhere north of Karnataka, they speak Hindi. So you're in Goa, Northeast India, Delhi, they speak Hindi. So it's nice to have a wife who speaks Hindi and Tamil. So
yeah, that's awesome.
I don't know what I would. Yeah, I would be in big trouble, like if I went to somewhere in India without that benefit. But so thank you to her for that. But why was I bringing up Sri Lanka? Anyway, so in Thailand, it's a Buddhist nation where it's out in the open. Like you drive down the interstate in Bangkok, and there's these big billboards on the side of the freeway that say, "The Buddha is not a decoration. Don't put the Buddha in your house as like a decoration or a souvenir. You're disrespecting the icon." And they had some really good literature in the hotel room. So in America, you might have a Gijin Bible in the hotel, but in Bangkok, Thailand, you've got these Buddhist texts. And, for the life of me, I can't remember what they're called. I think I wrote it down somewhere, but they're really good. And I don't know, maybe I'll try to find that after, well, let me see if I have it on my phone. you and I, as far as like future projects, that might be a really good group reading. I'll see if you can remember if you've heard of this text. It's called The Way of Practical Attainment. Does that ring a bell?
No. I mean, is that a translation of a original text in a Buddhist language, or is it Western work?
It's no, it was in the hotel room in Thailand. It was translated in English, but it was probably a Thai work originally. But we can discuss later off camera. But as far as I guess the point I'm trying to make is like you and I should definitely do some sort of like serious study of a Buddhist text, because I'll admit, I really don't have very much knowledge about that subject.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm definitely down for that. I kind of see Buddhism and Hinduism as sister religions. The more I explore them, the more I see that they're very much in. They're both intertextual traditions, and they more or less exist in the same constellation of ideas. So
yeah, it's kind of hard to see like where one begins, and in the sense that like the Buddha himself was a Hindu when he was a young man, right?
Right. Yeah, and even a lot of the things like when we think of Buddhism, we think, oh, he rejected the Vedas, but I mean there's Hindu traditions that reject the Vedas too, and he never kind of understood himself as not being a non-Hindu. So I see them as sister religions, and the more I explore the texts that inform these two traditions, the less I say that I'm one or the other. I kind of see myself as both a Hindu and a Buddhist.
Yeah, I could see that wouldn't be a contradiction. Let's see if we can have a few more comments before this thing dies.
Sure.
Elon Musk discovered and exploited a great need for easy monetary transactions inherent in humans. So you're wrong. He discovered something. Okay. He discovered that people wanted to buy stuff on the internet, and that's just like Jeff Bezos discovered people wanted to buy stuff online. But
isn't he mostly a car CEO of a car company, Tesla, right?
He is now. He has these stupid self-driving cars, which I don't know if you saw this news story. It was in Ted Kaczynski's Cabin Facebook group, where they it was actually Oswald Spengler. That's his username on Facebook. He shared this link that one of Tesla's self-driving cars actually hit a robot on a street in Las Vegas and killed it. So you had a machine killing another machine, which shows how smart both of them are, right?
Right. Yeah. That's fun.
Let's see what we got. What's another good perspective on Heidegger? Nice to hear this viewpoint. Who gives a good take on Heidegger that's not as influenced by Dreyfus and pragmatism? So who's a good source on Heidegger? Zizek was a Heideggerian in his younger years. Most people don't know that Sublime Objective Ideology was not his first book. I think it was his fourth book. The first three books by Zizek in the 80s were Slovenian texts on Heidegger. And Heidegger was the main philosophical school of thought in Slovenia when Heidegger was in graduate school. And Zizek has interesting things to say about Heidegger, no doubt. In fact, probably when Zizek is who's most interesting in books like Parallax View and Ticklish Subject. Some of the most interesting things that Zizek has to say are about Heidegger, but he's not in agreement, so you see him disagreeing with Heidegger. As far as who's good secondary literature on Heidegger, I don't know, because I feel that a lot of the good secondary literature I saw on Heidegger myself back in the day was written outside the United States anyway. Like there was a guy in some university in Egypt, Cairo, Egypt. He wrote a really interesting book on Heidegger, but I don't remember it because it was 7 years ago when I was in graduate school. So I cannot answer as far as secondary literature goes, but I'm doing a series on Heidegger being in time, like the day after tomorrow. So I mentioned I've been rereading the whole book. That's why I haven't been doing videos lately. And I've also been reading his lectures on phenomenology of religious experience, which is like a 1921 course. If you want to see like early Heidegger before being in time, like in like 1921, he did a course on Martin Luther and Paul and Augustine and phenomenology. So I'll be doing personally those series, those videos soon. And everybody who watches and gives their own perspective, that'll be really great to maybe start a discussion on. And yeah, I mean, that's what I got. And like, definitely, let's see what the other comments
I actually have some texts by Heidegger, but I haven't read them yet. This is what is called.
Oh yeah, what do you got there? Yeah, he's written so much. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's written so much that I don't know that anybody has read all of it, because even like a lot of it has been translated in English. But even my library when I was in grad school, we had like a huge collection of German texts by Heidegger, because it's not his writing so much as it's all the lecture series. So the 1921 course on Martin Luther and Paul, it was actually it's lecture notes by students of him, which had to be sort of reconstructed into essays by the translators, which, you know, that's a pretty monumental task. But, you know, Heidegger is one of those monumental. I think of some thinkers out there who there's a remarkable scarcity of literature written by them, like Homi Bhabha. So I'll never understand why my most viewed videos are always Homi Bhabha and Judith Butler. It's been that way since the first channel. But Homi Bhabha has really only written one book, and that book is just a bunch of essays. So I'm not downplaying him as a thinker. I'm just saying that, like, it's amazing how somebody could become that famous in academia with writing like 13 essays or something like that. And you've got these other thinkers who just have volumes and volumes of work. So yeah, that's gonna be great. And let's see, another comment here is I really like Zizek's book on Schelling. Yeah, I'll do a series of videos on that too. And how reliant on images will your Heidegger series be? I mostly listen to YouTube while doing other things. So the Heidegger videos I'll be doing with Google Slides, the sort of slideshow thing. Like, I don't know, Flowers, what do you think about that medium? Do you think it's better to do it with the slides or not?
I don't know that the videos where you do. I listen to all your lectures while I'm at work, so there's no. I can't be too conspicuous with the phone use, as I've said before. So I don't think I've missed a lot. I think you kind of use the slides to stay focused with your line of thinking more than. I don't think there's anything on the slides that you're not saying in yourself in the monologue. So yeah, I don't think. Yeah, I think they're great.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I think that one of the reasons for this was local people in India have trouble understanding my accent anyway, because the American accent is, they're more used to British accent. So I got a request from Indian viewers to provide subtitles. So I think that's why I did that. But certainly the slideshow is not going to be anything in addition. Some of the points are written down, and the images are kind of, you know, I don't want to say they're silly, but, you know, they're not super important. Like in my Foucault presentation on the section on leper of, you know, the death metal band Death, Leprosy, the album cover.
Yeah, oh yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I used to be a huge death metal fan actually in high school. Yeah, Chuck Schuldiner.
I think a lot of musicians. What's that?
The lead singer and guitarist Chuck Schuldiner, great musician.
Yeah, great musician. And it's funny because if you watch him speak, he's actually like, he sings like this kind of like monster, whatever. Like he's super super tough and he's kind of scary. But when he talks, people say he talks like a philosopher. He's actually a very sort of soft-spoken and intelligent speaker. Have you noticed that about him?
Yeah, I know he's a very intelligent guy, very articulate, and yeah, soft-spoken. Absolutely. He has Death has a song actually called "The Philosopher."
Yeah, it's really tragic. I don't know all the details about his death, but I think that it was, some people cite it as an example of how dysfunctional the American medical system is, that I think he died from running out of money to pay his cancer treatment bills, right?
Yeah, he had some kind of advanced. He was in an advanced stage, and yeah, I guess he couldn't keep up with the payments. Yeah, it's pretty very sad.
Well, yeah, because I mean, they don't even think twice about, like. So we spent a week in the hospital here in India, and um, the bill was, like $150. And my father went to the emergency room a couple years ago in America and spent a week in a hospital bed and got a bill for $90,000.
That's absurd. I mean, I fortunately now I have insurance through my employer, but it's still like it's just kind of absurd to have to pay. Paying like $30 to even see my primary care physician, for per visit. So, and it goes up
Well, I
from
mean,
there for specialists.
I could imagine if it's something like a surgery where they're actually doing something, but $90,000 to rent a bed, which is not even that comfortable. Like you could get a more comfortable bed at a Super 8 motel than that hospital has.
Yeah, yeah, it's grown out of control. I mean, people die waiting for treatments. It's
Yeah,
very
they
sad.
literally do die. Yeah, like they showed on on one documentary that one woman who was in the hospital and ran out of money. They just put her in a cab and dumped Los Angeles, where all the homeless people, they just dumped her to be another homeless person, basically, and that's what they'll do to you.
There's also, I mean, I've had some recent experience. I don't want to go too much into it, but the medical industry is so it's really there's a lot of incompetence. I mean, that
Oh yeah.
they don't communicate. The specialists don't communicate with each other. They don't even attempt to fully understand each other's reports and results. And there's a lot of miscommunication, misunderstanding. Things aren't sent. It's a bureaucracy too. The inept bureaucratic system.
Yeah, and most of what they do is just try to handle the bureaucracy. Like, Dmitry Orlov mentioned that he got sick in some Latin American country. I don't remember which, Costa Rica or someplace like that. And he went to the ER and he got treated, I think, for free by a very good Cuban doctor. A lot of very good doctors, I guess, in Latin America are from Cuba. So he had a minor problem in America and went to the ER and waited for a long time. And then they gave him like a painkiller. And there was like a 7-month battle between his insurance company and the hospital about whether they had to pay for it. And it just shows like the remarkable difference between here versus anywhere else in the world, pretty much, right?
I mean, I guess this is the result of tying every aspect of human existence to monetary, transactions and to the economy.
Yeah, and it's not going to go anywhere really except to collapse. And that's a whole nother video. But it looks like we got a few more comments. My mom says I'm keen. Says the images that Chad is going to hand illustrate them. Well, that's a possibility. We'll have to see about that. But
You draw, Chad?
That. What's that?
I said, do you draw?
I draw very cartoonish. I haven't improved my drawing skills since I was like 12 years old. So I still draw like a middle school kid. Francisco is back and says, in Jewish mysticism, Ein Sof stands for that which goes beyond all science as well. So interesting. I think a lot of serious mysticisms are going to have some concept for that. Alexander says, conclusion, do not say stuff like, as you can see in this diagram during the series, because some people can't see. David says, Death was a cool band. I'm from the UK. The NHS is a great thing. The National Health System. Well, anything's going to be better than the America. Alexander says, I got to go now. That was good. Looking forward to the Heidegger series. Dear Doug. Okay, so those are the comments. Okay, so anything, I know I kind of rattled them off because I really don't know how much longer this got, but anything you have to respond to those comments, Flowers?
Well, the comment about, a lot of the different traditions having this concept of going beyond, getting to the void or getting to something which doesn't have forms. I suspect that must frighten a lot of people who are not coming from that kind of worldview, because I mean, you talk about in your book about how like the Kurzweilian vision of salvation is basically our current the current enjoyments we have just projected into the future and without negative consequences. I mean, but the whole concept of getting to the void, I mean, that is a really radical thing, and to strive for that is pretty unthinkable in to the modern mind. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Well, you cut out a little bit, but so are you saying that anomaly would be scary to somebody today? So let me put it this way. So, if you read texts from the pre-modern era, so I've been reading, obviously a lot of Hindu stuff lately, but also Christian and Muslim accounts of mystics in the Middle Ages, and in somebody like the medieval Muslim mystic Rabia, whatever, female mystic, you have this story of her fasting for a long period of time, and then somebody presents the food, and then the food itself, I think, is taken from her, like, mystically, as a sort of reminder that the outcome of all of this mystical exercise is not going to be some worldly pleasure like even food. What you're looking forward to is something radically different. I think the voice of God interrupts and tells her that. And that's completely the opposite of what Ray Kurzweil would promise, because for him, you're not getting a different pleasure than the one you get in this life. You're just getting this one purified. So I think that in the medieval era, if you were Christian mysticism is the same thing. You have this rejection of being attached to the kind of pleasures in this life. In Isaac of Nineveh and other sort of Christian mystics from the medieval era and the ancient world, because the next world is not going to be like that. It's going to be something completely different, and you might as well start preparing for that mentally now. But with Ray Kurzweil, it's the exact opposite. You're clinging to the familiar because you psychologically are even less able to handle anomaly. And I think, Jordan Peterson talks about, like, we have ways of dealing with anomaly, but if those ways become dysfunctional, you're confronted with chaos and a loss of meaning. And I think that there's something to that. I think that we've become so much more fragile psychologically today that for us, imagining the next life being something radically anomalous is way more uncomfortable than just saying, no, you're just going to be on drugs and you're going to have like perfect AI-generated prostitutes, and you're basically going to be surfing the net 24/7 as a virtual being for the rest of your life, right?
Yeah, and transcendence is about, it's so qualitatively different. You're not transcending to a happier state, or basically you're transcending to that which is completely impersonal. At least in Hinduism and Buddhism, you're dissolving everything that's personal, everything that takes on a form. So it's so radically different than the notion of getting to enjoy things. I mean, like the popular conception of heaven, which is enjoyment without consequence. That's not, and I mean, that's not even that's not a sophisticated, that's not the kind of sophisticated understanding I'm sure you have in even Western or in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But that's kind of like the popular notion of the soul, right? It's your personality still carries on, whereas transcendence in the purpose of Buddhist meditation is to basically break that, completely shatter that, and get to something that's totally impersonal.
Sorry, you were cutting out a little bit there, but I think I got most of what you said. And yeah, I think that it is a measure of psychological health, how open you are to anomaly. I think in the sense that somebody who's completely resistant or completely unwilling to contemplate the kind of radical anomaly of an afterlife pleasures is somebody who's not very fit for handling anomaly as it emerges in their daily life. So the question of whether you have, as in the Middle Ages, this test of how detached can you be from the pleasures of daily life, knowing that those are not going to transfer over. And, most people fail at that test because for most people, they can't accept that, they can't accept the promise that there really is going to be enough of a benefit to let go of the pleasures right now, right? And that's kind of the test in the medieval era. But I think that, with the latest ones, we're not only really envisioning something different, we're kind of just envisioning, like, even when you hear fantasies about, the Uber economy is just going to let everybody get jobs from their smartphone and work when they want to. This idea that it doesn't matter that we're losing the jobs we have right now because we can go to some job board and try to compete with 150 other people for one job that pays $20, even if you are lucky enough to get it. And the idea that that's going to be the future is something new is really just what everybody's doing right now anyway, which is sitting on their smartphones and looking for stuff to come up online, right?
Yeah, it's not gonna work out. I mean, I already see it in my own life. It's a scam, as you put it in one of your peak oil news streams. It's a stopgap measure that doesn't pay off in the end.
Well, yeah, the only people who are benefited by this, obviously, are like the CEO of Uber is made out like a bandit from having a bunch of people drive at a loss their own car, their own gas, everything for him. And he didn't have to drive a single car to make all that money. He didn't have to wear and tear a car and get the oil changes and everything, wear out the tires. And then, of course, people had car accidents when they were driving for Uber. He didn't have to do any of that. He just made a bunch of money to sit on his ass while a bunch of machines did the work for him. And, rather than rebel against that, as I think the mythology is not going to be kind to people like that. You and I talk about the mythology of the far future. I don't think it's going to be kind to people like that. I think we're going to look back at people like that as the villain. The mythology 100 years from now is going to be somebody who does exactly that. Some asshole sitting in an air-conditioned office, letting the machines do the work for him, and everybody else suffers, and he becomes very wealthy, right?
Yeah, and I think there's already a sense among a large part of the population that technological mediation is already a kind of evil. It's already kind of robbing you of control over. Well, in the case of Uber, right, your own the quality of your productive life is kind of completely being taken away from you. Right? At least if you have a physical space, you can have certain control over your workspace, and the regularity of it kind of affords you certain control, certain sense of being grounded. Whereas with Uber, you're just completely under the control of an anonymous app. I think people are starting to get a sense of the problem of technological mediation too, even if it's just in that small way. I'm just being pulled from gig to gig, and it's not even enough to have just Uber. Now you've got to have Lyft and all these other things, because one thing can't, it doesn't cut it. So
It's ridiculous. And I mean, I lived in a village in India where, I had a guy who's lived in the village a while come down and help me with, we were going to plant some tapioca plants, which is the thing to grow in that area. Potatoes don't grow well. I planted some potatoes, which I've grown pretty easily in America, but it's way too hot in this part of India for that. So you grow tapioca. And he was telling me that this road that I live on, just 10 years ago, they had bull carts on it. Just 10 years ago, it was dirt roads. And, there are parts of India I've been to where you still have bull carts. Like I've posted some pictures, I think on Facebook like a year ago when I was in India, like in some parts of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, you still have people riding with bull carts. And that's the future. So if you want to ask what the future of transportation is going to be, it's not Uber. It's bull carts. But most people cannot contemplate that. And a lot of people might hear me say that right now and say, well, that's fantasy. It's like, no, that's what I've seen like a couple of weeks ago when I was in Karnataka.
that's interesting. I mean, but even in American history, in early American politics, people did try to contemplate this, right? Isn't that the famous debate between Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton, between whether we should become an agricultural nation or go into manufacturing? It is interesting, at that early stage of American politics, people were thinking along the lines that we're trying to think today.
Well, today we're neither.
But now it's unthinkable.
Well, yeah, I mean, but today we're neither because the debate manufacturing versus agriculture, at this point, we're neither. All the manufacturing has been outsourced and all the agriculture is done by machines. So, like, I'll admit, we grow food or something kind of like food. It's actually very bad for you, the genetically modified frankenfood, which is just drenched in pesticides. But we grow a lot of it, but 97% of people do not work in that field, and many of the people who do work a second job. So most farmers actually have a second job because they're so deep in debt, and the price of food is so artificially low because of the fossil fuels that they have to work a second job at McDonald's, and on top of being a farmer. So at this point we're neither agricultural nor manufacturing. And the question, what do 300 million people do if you're neither, is you either have, as I always mention, you either have this aristocracy of people who, like the CEO of Uber, he doesn't lift a finger in his life to lift anything heavier than, I don't know, like a mouse, which you don't even have to lift, by the way. The hardest physical work he has to do is push a mouse or click a button on a computer. He becomes a billionaire. And we have this aristocracy, and it's not just the 1%, by the way. Many of the upper middle class who like I always mentioned, like the Elizabeth Warren crowd, like Elizabeth Warren's up there preaching about the 1%, while she's working at Harvard, making $180,000 a year and lecturing 2 hours a week. And she's acting like she's uniquely oppressed by the 1% when she's one of the most privileged. But that's the state of, I'll just say it, the Democrat Party right now, is that person will become a front runner. But you have people like that. You have this aristocracy, either the CEOs, obviously, but also people like Elizabeth Warren before she became a senator, and still is these people from the upper middle class who are insanely privileged, but still don't feel satisfied that they're not as wealthy as someone like Mark Zuckerberg. And outside that, you have masses and masses of minimum wage workers who are economic non-persons. You have people working 20 hours a week at Taco Bell, and then another 20 hours a week driving for Uber and losing money, and then another 20 hours a week cleaning motels. And they're living in their car, they're living in motels. Like when I was working at a truck stop a year ago, a lot of the people at that truck stop lived in a hotel across the road, and it was not a nice hotel. It was a hotel where, they were dealing drugs at this hotel, and that's what he was known for. And sometimes you have a guy come into the truck stop, like high off his ass on methamphetamine. It's like, what are you doing, man? He's like, well, they just kicked me out of the motel. And it's like, well, you got kicked out of that place. You must be acting pretty, out of the ordinary. But that's where these people were living. They were living in a motel, and it was not a nice motel. And they were working full time at this truck stop, and they couldn't even afford to live one room because it was over $100 a night. So they were pooling their resources, living like 4 or 5 of them to a hotel or something crazy like that. And that's what many people in America are living like right now. And that's what happens if you become a country that's neither agricultural or manufacturing. And the media pretends it's not the case. And I think that's what's driving more than anything the Jordan Peterson phenomenon is. There's obviously a lot of people who are very discontented. It's in the millions. There are millions of people who are deeply disgruntled with the situation. And the elites are too stupid to realize that it's them who are the cause of this, right?
Yeah, and I think Zizek actually has a very interesting analysis of this situation and the problems. He problematizes the possible solutions that the leftists have proposed, like universal basic income, which he attacked as potentially a huge generator of resentment among the working class, because at least in capitalism, you're poor. Well, you can always blame someone else. What universal basic income implies is that you lost the game, and because the people above you are just that much smarter and better than you, and so you can you're forced to live off of their the effort that they put into their productive lives, whereas you have no way of there's nothing to build your self-esteem off of, and there's nothing to build, nothing to blame other than yourself. So it's interesting. I don't think even making everybody well off is going to be necessarily a solution to this problem of huge.
Well, most people are already pretty well off. Like, honestly, even almost everybody in America has, unless they're homeless, hot showers and drinkable water coming out the tap. Although I'll admit that water's a little more shady than most people realize with the fracking and all of the chemicals, but it's still, it's drinkable water, and 3 meals a day, and but the thing is, we already got, at least until very recently, the universal raise in standard of living, but it was not enough to get over the psychological problem of meaninglessness.
Right.
And you'll find that the most disgruntled, the most psychologically empty, I should say, people are actually the ones with the most financially material security. So the thing that Kaczynski mentions in Psychology of Leftism is the most concerned people about social injustice or the inequality of the system. Let's put it that way. The people who critique the system as unfair the most are 6-figure salary Ivy League professors at places like Yale and Harvard and Princeton. And it's just interesting that somebody who would be the most critical of how unfair the system is somebody who's benefiting disproportionately from it.
Yeah, is closer to the top than everybody else is. But so I want to press you a little bit on this. What do you think about people like the Democrats like Andrew Lang, who's proposing universal basic income? I think there really is something to Zizek's critique that it's not a solution because it doesn't address the issue of meaning and resentment.
Yeah, I've gotten comments about that guy recently from Francisco too, and he sounds very in line with a lot of. I mean, let me put it this way: he's the kind of guy I can't find anything to disagree with, because he's in favor of forgiving student debt, and he's in favor of taxing the same sort of billionaires that I always critique. So I can't find anything to disagree with him. But I, for one, don't think it's going to happen, because the student loan people, especially, are far too wealthy in the short term anyway to allow anything to happen. But I think that the problem of meaninglessness is not going to be solved, because in suburbia, when I was a teenager anyway, a lot of people, before the recession, a lot of people didn't have real material problems, and they were still they were more depressed, despite that fact. So you didn't have people going hungry in suburbia, but you still had this huge, emo culture, which I mentioned in my book. Like, the emo movement is hard to imagine outside of suburbia and outside of fossil modernity. Like, you couldn't imagine, could you imagine a bunch of emo kids in a medieval village?
No.
Because emo was all about pretending to be depressed so you could fit in with group people. Because, when I was in high school, my friends at the end of high school suddenly all got into emo. And it was just a contest of who could be more depressed and who could pretend that they cut their wrists more. I doubt they were actually doing it, but they would all pretend that they were doing it. And it was a bizarre thing to be friends over, because there's some hit cliques that form over common interests, playing football. Or, I don't know if it's as common where you live, but when I was in high school, there was the Cowboys, the group of guys who wear cowboy hats, and they go to rodeos and they shoot guns. That's one group in high school, is the Cowboys, and skateboarders and whatever. But being depressed and cutting yourself, pretending to anyway, became a common interest around to be friends, right?
Yeah, we had all the same groups in New York, minus the Cowboys. That's more particular, I guess, to your region of the states. But
yeah, I don't know how many rodeos you got in New York City.
Yeah, but no, yeah, I see that. I saw it the same way. It's they needed a wound to nurse, because that was the meaning. That's what generated meaning in their life, is that they had this wound that they kind of created themselves and nursed, and without that, yeah, there's nothing. There's just the banality of city life for me, and of life in Colorado for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things what is it? Goo Goo Dolls, "You bleed just to know you're alive," is one of the lyrics from Iris. It's basically the idea: you'd rather feel super depressed or make yourself feel super depressed, because then you'll at least feel something. And we had so little stimulation, because most of suburban life is actually just sitting on your ass and watching television or something. You're sitting around doing nothing. And Kaczynski and Greer both mentioned that the reason media is, if you go even a few minutes doing that, you'll go insane, because you use television, for example, or at this point we use YouTube or whatever to constantly stimulate our nervous system, because we have to block out how boring it is to sit around and do nothing. But the only reason we have this state where we're sitting around doing nothing all the time is because all of the stuff that needs to be done, it still needs to be done. We're just not doing it. And, Dmitry Orlov says to people who are worried about employment in the future, that there's never a shortage of work. There's a shortage of jobs right now in America for very artificial reasons, but it's not a lack of work. There's always work to be done. We just don't do it. And I think that more than Andrew Yang's universal income, I think the solution to people finding meaning is to just go back to doing stuff. Because you worked in urban farming yourself in New York, and you had the experience of finding that the farming itself, regardless of the product, which are obviously great to get to. Farming itself became like an activity that you could get a lot out of, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's the thing that people don't realize is like right now, my farming business is on hold, but in my current job, I do a lot of routinized physical labor, a lot of repetitive tasks, and you would think that would drive people insane, but there's actually more satisfaction in just doing very simple, honest physical labor over and over and over again than sitting on your butt and sitting in a cubicle. That is far less satisfying than doing repetitive physical tasks because there's a certain well, I mean, I guess it goes back to it's not enough. Like, I mean, obviously, I would prefer to make music and do farming work to working in a warehouse like I'm doing currently. But working your body in that way, kind of fully exercising your physical self, is far more satisfying than the kind of cognitive tasks that we idealize and romanticize
Right.
today.
We've reached a bizarre point in history where people would rather do nothing than do something, and that's what they're literally doing. If you have Stephen Colbert had like a simulation of a Chinese factory on his program where he turned it into a video game where you assemble one thing and then you get another one, you have to assemble it exactly the same. And his audience was cringing, like all of these, people who work in offices were cringing at the idea of like, oh my God, I can't imagine like that person is actually physically working. Doesn't it seem really boring? And like, that's how in the cave people have become, is they don't realize that that's doing something. And they would rather, they're portraying doing nothing as preferable to that. And that's how distorted their mindset has become. Right?
Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention, since you mentioned farm work, is the reason that farm work is so satisfying is not only because, again, you of the physical exercise, the deep satisfaction you get from exerting yourself physically, but also because there's a direct connection to bodily needs, right? To survival, the most basic survival needs. Whereas if you're sitting in a cubicle, you have to come up with this bullshit rationalization. You kind of have to rationalize yourself. You have to kind of artificially connect whatever this bullshit thing that you're doing is to survival. There's so much mediation. You get a paycheck, you get a piece of paper, and that you have to go to the bank and put it into the bank, and then you go, in your SUV to the grocery store, and then you purchase these foods that were created somewhere else. I mean, there's so many layers of mediation, and you have to really strain to make a connection between the work that you're actually doing and the way that it allows you to fulfill basic needs. Whereas if you're doing farm work and subsistence farming, you put all that effort, you put all that labor into producing this final thing that you can physically consume at the end. And so I think it's also that if you want to restore meaning, you're going to have to go back to tasks that are directly tied to a sense of autonomy and fulfillment of survival needs in a more direct way than the kind of tasks that we have available today. And I'm kind of regurgitating Kaczynski, right?
But I mean, it's the truth, and it's not at all weird because nobody's saying the same thing. Like, the thing is, if people do pay lip service to the local food movement, for example, they don't think of it as a way to negate this sort of lifestyle. The local food movement has largely just become a way for yuppies to show that they're more environmentally conscious than the Walmart voter by, just going for an hour once a week to the farmers market to load up on on materials. You kind of miss the point that like the point of it is not just to consume it; it's also to try to get people in the local community to do this farming. And I don't think that the local food movement is going to lead anywhere. My own honest opinion, I don't think it's going to lead anywhere on its own, because I think that the only way people will get to do this is out of desperation. Because the only place where I've seen a local food movement that I really sort of approve of a lot is to try, and that's people who in many cases are not farming because like they want to be like like trendy, like environmentally conscious people. They're doing it out of desperation because the unemployment rate and the lack of jobs and the cost of shipping food from way out of Michigan into Detroit has made it so expensive that they're better off just growing it in vacant lots, which are pretty easy to find in Detroit. And honestly, that's, if you want to know what local food in the future is going to look like, it's that.
Yeah. I mean, that's where what I'm leaning towards as well, is how to take the skills that I acquired in that. The tragedy of this business that I started, growing greens, was that it's so difficult. I mentioned this to you privately. Like, there's so much red tape. There's so many regulations associated with having an actual, freestanding a greenhouse outdoors. It's considered a building, and it's subject to so many different regulations that I didn't even want to bother with that. So instead of doing honest farm work outside in a relatively ecological way, I had to bring it indoors and run it out of a spare bedroom in my home with air conditioning and artificial lighting and all of this stuff. So absurd.
Yeah, I mean, you're growing lettuce. You're not growing marijuana. You know what I'm saying? Like, it'd be borderline whether it was worth it monetarily to grow with the grow lights from marijuana, which is a lot more, money. Not saying it should be. That's not a pro-pot statement, by the way, as somebody who's from Colorado. But I'm just saying, like, I'm from Colorado. I know what it takes, how much electricity it takes for these people to grow with indoors with grow lights. It's borderline not even worth it for pot. It's definitely not worth it for lettuce in terms of money. And why would you anyway when you have sunlight right outside?
Right. Yeah, and the only way that I was able to get away with it is, selling to yuppies who wanted, who consume this stuff because it afforded them a certain status.
It's ridiculous, and it's wasteful of the resources we have, because like in the olden days, you would grow pot with grow lights indoors because you could go to jail if you were growing it outdoors with sunlight. So we were wasting resources to do what nature was already doing much better. Because in Colorado back in the day, everybody knew that the best pot was grown outdoors in sunlight. Like when I worked at the factory, one guy claimed that the factory job was just a front for him. He wasn't a very good worker. He would come into work on some days and not on other days. And when he came to work, he didn't work very hard. And he told me it was because he was already making pretty good money growing pot, but he was growing it in the woods. So they called this guerrilla farming in Colorado. You would go to some remote part in the forest in the mountains and you would grow pot there. And he was growing much better pot with sunlight, obviously, than he would have spent a lot more money with grow lights. But that's pot. Like, honestly, how could you justify doing that for lettuce, which last I checked, you go to Walmart, a head of lettuce is like $1.
Yeah. What he says is absolutely correct. I mean, I've tried myself growing stuff, the same stuff that I used to grow for my business outside, and it's a far more intuitive process when you're outdoors, and there's a lot less to screw up. Because you have to control the climate, you have to control the conditions a lot more. Whereas outdoors, it just kind of takes care of itself, and you just have to monitor it. So, it's insane. But you have these regulations, and you have all this red tape, and you mentioned like Colorado banning growing your own food and collecting your own rainwater. And these kinds of things are a way of I use the term borrowing from Kaczynski, forced collectivization, where if you have if you control the bottom of the hierarchy of needs, then all other kinds of dependence kind of follow from that. So
yeah, I think Dmitry Orlov mentions, and by the way, you want to just know like who's one of the most enjoyable people to read. Definitely Dmitry Orlov is one of them. Everybody watching, and you also, but he mentions that like the thing he mentions is a Russian who moved to America is that we take for granted in America that it's normal to have this many cops putting this many people in prison for this many different ways to break the law. But that's actually really unusual, even within terms of the world. And America incarcerates more people than any country in the world. And we do that because we have the most complicated legal system probably that's ever existed. And legal systems that are complicated are by definition unjust. Because if it's this complicated as we have it, if you have enough lawyers, you can find any loophole to get out of trouble. But if you can't afford a lawyer at all, they can find anything to put you behind bars. So obviously the people who come out the losers are the poor, and they can put you in jail for anything. And, I understand that I could go to jail myself too someday. I mean, the bill collectors are, the student loan collectors are looking for me in America, and they're idiots because they're looking at an address I haven't lived at since a year ago. But, I understand that they have at their disposal to find me if I was there. Now, that's the village I live in India with no, it has no Wikipedia page and it has no house number. It's actually a house with a name in Malayalam. It's the name of the owner, okay, which even I don't know what it is, okay. But they're not smart enough yet to find that, but someday they could. And I live with the realization every day that I could go to jail. And at that point, I'll just be like Ted Kaczynski. I'll be writing books from behind prison walls and trying to get it out to the public. And I've come to peace with that. Like I grew up in a prison town, so I used to be deathly afraid of prison because I lived so close to it. 15 prisons in the county. In fact, that's where Ted Kaczynski's in prison, is where I grew up in Colorado. But I used to be deathly afraid of it. But I've come to terms with it, the fact that it could happen. And the thing that Dmitry Orlov mentions, in addition to if it's that complicated they could get you for anything, is that it's also expensive for them to persecute people. And he says that there's going to be a bet or a race in the far future between people who the system will persecute as long as they have the resources, and the people who will out-survive the system's ability to persecute them. So the idea here is that it's going to be a bet. There's going to be some people that the system would like to persecute, but eventually they'll run out of the money to do so. And that's literally the position I'm in, is it's an open bet. 10 years from now, will they still be able to persecute me for this? I don't know. I mean, it's honestly an open question for me. But that's the thing that they got to keep in mind too, is if you have a very, very, very long enemies list, you're going to have to pay for the police and the prisons and the courts and the surveillance equipment and all of that stuff for all of them. And our ability to do so, the United States' ability to do so, is not going to last much longer.
Yeah, and I said this to you as earlier, like that really raises the question of human nature. I mean, the kind of implied in that line of thinking is this is just the product of human nature, or maybe the more pernicious aspects of human nature, plus oil, plus this explosive energy source. So that's kind of a depressing line of thought to consider.
Well, once the oil's gone, they'll just go back to being malicious, but much less powerful. And I mean, you mentioned Foucault's Discipline and Punish. He mentions that in archaic models of punishment, a lot of times the punishment is banishment. So a lot of times in the olden days, they would either kill you. At that point, they wouldn't have to house you in prison any longer. They would either kill you or they would banish you. at which point they're also not having to pay to house you and feed you and all that stuff. And we've reached this bizarre point now where I've already banished myself from America. I've already exiled myself, but they just won't let me be. So they can do that, but only because they still think that they have enough resources to waste with persecuting someone who's already banished himself. And that's not going to last much longer.
So they can pursue you across continents. That's shocking.
They could. Like, there was a guy who fled the country to China, and he had an arrest warrant because he was a child molester. He was molesting his own daughter. So he fled the country to China, and they spent about a year looking for him, and they finally got him, and they extradited him back to America. So obviously, like, for somebody who's like a child molester, they can extradite you. But I don't know that they would waste that much resources to extradite me back to America. But they certainly could refuse to renew my visa. And that's the really scary thing. I don't even know if I want to mention that on YouTube to give them ideas, but yeah, there's certainly things that they could do to get me back. And I live with the realization, I mentioned in my book, I write that I'm writing these ideas because I don't know how much longer I have to write them. Because Kaczynski released Anti-Tech Revolution because he didn't know how much longer he'd live, and he didn't know how much longer he'd be able to release materials from prison as a terrorist, as he's formally listed. And I think, there's something like with... beg your pardon? Yeah, I'm on a video call right now. Okay. Oh, yes. Sorry. So, it's one of those things which I think all of us should really realize we don't have as much time as we think to get this stuff written down. And I'm writing the book now because I know that I can't just say, like, 15 years from now, I'll finally get around to writing it.
I admit I don't understand the whole student loan situation to the extent that you do, but I don't know. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but if we have now a candidate who's seriously talking about loan debt forgiveness, I sincerely hope that that's where that's where we ultimately end up, and that you do get to come back to the States. Because that's truly terrible, and no one deserves that.
Well, if you think I'm exaggerating, if anybody thinks I'm exaggerating about the arrest warrants, there's over 1,000 people who've already gotten them. So
yeah.
Yeah. This is a real thing. Like, there's already people with arrest warrants for not paying their student loans, and what they'll send a summons to court to an old address, and when you fail to appear, suddenly they have an arrest warrant at your current address, which suddenly they know exactly where you live, and they don't get you for not paying the bill, at least not directly. They get you for, it's like getting fired from a job. Like, they change the schedule on you, and then they fire you for not showing up to work. That's the old sort of dirty trick to get someone fired. And like, the legal system is doing the same thing right now, only the outcome is prison.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I didn't mean to suggest that the consequences weren't as grave, potentially grave as you described. I just meant that I hope that the idea that this guy's floating out there about universal, not basic income, debt forgiveness, that becomes a thing. I think there's a small possibility of that happening, just because they might, we might come to the realization that if you don't do that, this could be the basis of a serious revolt. You have a lot of young people who are extremely frustrated, and you're not going to give them any way out. That could be a recipe for disaster.
Well, and you also didn't give them anything in return, because a lot more people are starting to realize, like, that was some very expensive snake oil. Because, like, you're gonna tell me that watching a documentary on prison is worth $50,000 or more? Like, a lot of people are waking up like, come on. this is not worth what you claim it was. And you've got a very serious revolt coming. I don't deny that. But I think, honestly, this guy, he's going to have a run just like Bernie Sanders. Because Bernie Sanders was also a guy who said a lot of things that he had a lot of, he was willing to critique problems that nobody else was, let me put it that way. And he had a pretty good following. And if the Democrat Party was fair with how they did the voting, he would have won the primary. But they're not fair. Like, they only allow people to vote who are registered members, which skews it in favor of the establishment voters who are already grandfathered into the system. And they chose Hillary Clinton last time. And this time you're going to see something similar. I think that Elizabeth Warren is a pretty good candidate for winning the primary, but she's by no means the only one, because there's other people like her who could just as easily. But no, I do not think that this man is going to win the primary. I don't think he's going to get the nomination, even though he obviously should.
No, but I do think it's interesting that someone is, I don't know, maybe it's the success of people like Alan Collins. Maybe his efforts have just at least brought this to people's awareness at the level of mainstream politics. Maybe again, I'm being overly optimistic, but maybe it's an encouraging sign.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a part of it. I think the biggest thing, though, is just how intrinsically bad it is. Because, when I was first in student loan trouble back in 2011, I didn't know anything about Alan Collins at that time. Not downplaying his contribution at all. I'm just saying I didn't know anything about him or his project or anybody else. I just knew that I was in one hell of a problem. And there's 44 million people with student loans, and like all of them know that they're in a problem. All of them know they're in a mess. And the student loan justice movement, it just kind of gives them a way to voice it, because otherwise they'll feel like it's just them. But there's a few comments here. Let's go ahead and see. There's
So I just to let you know, I gotta head to the temple in about half an hour or so.
Okay, yeah, we'll probably wrap this up after these comments. I probably need to head down and start making some food for me and my wife. But let's see. There's a comment about Chad. When will you be giving notifications on Twitter? I actually forgot that I even had a Twitter account. When I brought back the channel last April, I started a Twitter and a Facebook page and the YouTube and the Google Plus. And I had like 5 followers on Twitter or something last I checked. So I'm like, well, I just forgot to keep updating. I don't even know how many followers I have now, but yeah, I should definitely go back to using that. And Francisco says, I think universal basic income is good because it's like a game where you don't have to start at zero, nor do you have to waste fossil fuel to do meaningless work. That's a great point. In fact, universal basic income, he says, wouldn't be enough to live on by itself, but it would be enough to help subsidize less glamorous but more necessary work like various trades that need doing. Yeah, so that's a good point. But I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a good idea. I'm just saying I don't think it's going to happen, because I don't think Andrew Yang is going to get the nomination. I think they're going to give it to Elizabeth Warren. And honestly, if she runs, you're probably just going to get Trump once again, because I don't see any difference between her and Hillary Clinton. And if you don't know how people react to Hillary Clinton in the heartland, like workers in the middle of Colorado, it's not well. Okay, and that's not because of misogyny or whatever. It's just because there's a disconnect between somebody from the aristocracy and the working masses who know exactly how such a person feels about them. So Maxwell says, have you guys smoked pot? Any opinions on psychedelic experience from a philosophical standpoint? Maybe the legalization of pot will make the general population a little more philosophical. Okay, so 3 questions there. Flowers, are you going to give your response to them?
I don't know. I mean, I'm like totally sober, and for me, I don't think I've had wilder experiences in meditation than I ever did on pot. So I don't know, if you're looking to open your mind, I would say maybe consider meditation. Now, the only thing is meditation is hard work, whereas pot isn't. So Yeah, I guess if you're lazy and you want to, experience something out of the ordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced, like, okay, so the legal pot experience in Colorado is what drove the real estate there to completely ridiculous levels because everybody had to move to Colorado to get the legal pot experience. So, what the legal pot experience actually is you go to a dispensary and you have to spend like $200 to get some legal pot. And if you smoke it, it's either going to, my own opinion, it's either going to immobilize you to where you'll be so immobilized that you won't be able to productively do anything. And that's not what philosophy is. Philosophy is not sitting on your ass with a bunch of Cheetos and something funny on television. It's not that. Philosophy is hard work.
Yeah.
And I think that pot either will immobilize you or it will make you paranoid. So even when I was smoking legal pot, I didn't do it much, by the way. I just had to do it after it was legalized and all that. But I remember standing by the door looking for the cops because I was that paranoid. Like, are they coming? And like, that's not very good for philosophy either. So obviously, like, there might be somebody watching this video who will say, well, my experience with pot was something completely different. And I'll grant that. I'm not going to say that everybody is experiencing like that. I'm just saying that the legal pot experience in Colorado, which people have to move from all the way across the country to experience, I found it pretty overrated. And honestly, I think that you'll open up your mind a lot more just from philosophizing because, like, if you're sitting on the couch immobilized, you're not going to think new thoughts. You might think redundant thoughts that you've already thought. You're not going to think anything new.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. I actually missed the part about philosophy. And I jumped to meditation. No, I agree. So yeah, pot versus philosophy. Always choose philosophy. I mean, pot isn't going to make you more self-reflexive. Um, yeah, what are the long-term effects? Does it, it's not going to make you more self-reflexive. It's going to stunt your ability to think clearly about things afterwards, right? Whereas if you philosophize, the more you train yourself to think logically and systematically, the better you become as a thinker. And the same thing in meditation. There's no similar kind of progress you can make by just ingesting a substance.
Right, because if it was that simple, then everybody would do it, and there wouldn't be a difference between great philosophers like Heidegger and the in the sense that like he had to actually work. Because the thing about Heidegger is like he had to actually work, to learn the whole tradition. And one of his quotes, which I guess we'll sort of maybe wrap this up with, is if you don't learn the tradition very, very well, you'll repeat it, but think that you have some original idea. And like I hear this all the time with people who are maybe who've never studied any philosophy, but they think that they have original philosophical insights. Like, we can't believe in religion because everything has to be based on experience. And it's like, yeah, that's not a new insight. Like there's nothing new about that. Or they might say something like, like we can't believe in things without proof. And it's like, yeah, that's not a very, brilliant philosophical insight. That's actually quite simple. And the thing is, like, it might seem when you're studying all of this other people's thoughts, like it's going to inhibit your originality. But I don't think that you can really have any original ideas unless you have a very good understanding of other people's thoughts. And that's going to do you a lot more good. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Yeah. So, and the one thing I wanted to say is, with ingesting substances that supposedly open up your mind, if the commenter meant like weed can make you more receptive to new ideas and novel ways of thinking, from my own experience, the people who say that and smoke weed, they're receptive to all the wrong ideas. Like they become susceptible to believing in conspiracies more than thinking about the works of Heidegger. So yeah, sure, it makes you more receptive, but to what exactly? It doesn't make you more. It makes you more receptive to conspiratorial thinking, and yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, Alex Jones, when he was on Joe Rogan's show, he said at this point that the conspiracy people used to turn to him as the voice of reason, but now they're turning against him. So it's to the point now where even Alex Jones, there's conspiracies about him.
Too much weed, maybe.
I guess that would be a good place to wrap this up. Thank you. I didn't realize we'd be talking this long. I appreciate your time. And I know this is your day off, so thank you for spending this time with me and with the YouTube audience. And definitely we'll have to continue this sometime. It works for you and all that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I look forward to it. I relish good conversation, so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to pick your mind on such a diverse range of topics, and I appreciate the suggestions too. It really, I very much enjoyed reading Aristotle and thinking about all this stuff.
Yeah, and we'll definitely, we'll talk, privately about what to read next, and we'll keep this up. This was a really nice discussion we had around Aristotle and a lot of other topics too. But yeah, it was great. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Okay, take care.